So today we are talking about hex crawling. It's what a lot of people have asked about. Talked about some of the hex mapping I've done, but not about sort of the actual jumping into mechanics of how you get in there and just sort of use it as sort of a mode of play, and use it as, you know, something that's to bring something different to your game that's not sort of dungeon delving or that very sort of narrative heavy play where it's more about the plot and sort of going through a sequence of events. And this is sort of hex crawling brings something that's a little bit different to that. So that's what we're going to kind of go over today, because I think a lot of people are sort of interested in this way of game, in this different mode of play, especially for D&D, Pathfinder, or other TTRPGs, but they don't really know too much about it, or what they might know is kind of comes from people who are in sort of the OSR, the old school Renaissance, and kind of talking about using sort of older systems or forks of older systems, repackages, whether that's, you know, OSE, white box, white hack, you know, there are a number, right, there's a whole bunch of them. But for somebody who's maybe looking to incorporate some of those elements more in something that's, you know, what they call the most popular RPG in the world, right, or tabletop RPG in the world, the 5th edition of D&D, those things don't sometimes match up. And so I built a system that's around sort of 5e specifically, but you could, with very few tweaks, you can make it work for something like Pathfinder very, very, very easily. You just basically need to adjust the DCs for it. So that's sort of what we're going to talk about today. But I think before we kind of jump into it, and I'm going to kind of go through my system and why it's a little bit different, the first thing I kind of want to do is kind of give an overview of just sort of hex crawling in general, because I never know sort of how much people sort of know about it or the context of the subject. So I want to do that sort of first, just so we can kind of get it out of the way, so everybody's kind of on the same level to know about sort of what we're talking about when we talk about hex crawls, what that means, the style of play, why it is what it is, and sort of why it evolved, why it showed up in general, and why it sort of went away and then sort of has come back as sort of like a resurgence. Let's go ahead and hop into that. So, right, if you don't know, what is hex crawling? So hex crawling is sort of this middle child of D&D adventure styles that sort of evolved. So the original D&D, everything was very focused around sort of the dungeon specifically. And this sort of like mega dungeon, basically one level of dungeon equates to basically one player character level. And so you basically have dungeons that start at 1, and then 2, 3, 4, 5, 6. They go all the way down, and every time the characters level up, you build basically a new level of the dungeon for them to go back into. And then there's basically in the dungeon, and then they jump out of the dungeon, go back to town, sell all their loot, resupply, go back to the dungeon. Or you have things sort of like the Yawning Portal and Hallister's Undermountain, which there's no actual travel time between it, because, and the same thing is true with the Ruins Under Castle Greyhawk, because the dungeon's right there. The dungeon's on site, right? And there's basically a door into dungeon, which doesn't seem like great design for a settlement, right? To have a settlement right on top of a dungeon that's got a lot of nasty monsters in it. But that is what it is. So it's sort of because of that we kind of see the exploration sort of branch out a little bit. And so this sort of middle style evolved after the dungeon, so it's sort of the middle child. So basically we have the dungeon, and then they were like, okay, well, maybe if we put something in between the dungeon and the town that's like some sort of interest, right? And so there's sort of exploration kind of showed up, and that's before sort of what is sometimes referred to as the Hickman Revolution, which is the more narrative style play that people coming into D&D 5e and the hobby now are probably a lot more familiar with, because that's sort of the primary mode of play, or at least it is for sort of published modules and sort of the way that the games present themselves now, rather than sort of the older style. And so that basically, when we look at the sort of the Hickman Revolution, we've seen this narrative style gameplay where it sort of removes, in the same way that you sort of edit a book or a film, it removes sort of any extraneous scenes that don't serve that specific plot line, that specific story that we're looking at. And so we don't, anything that would be things like travel in the middle, which is gets sort of pulled out because they're like, well, that doesn't really serve the narrative. We need them to get where they're going because they need to, you know, have this one plotted out scene that they need to get to, and anything that happens sort of in between there is sort of like characters, you know, taking phone calls or using the bathroom, the sort of things that you don't see. It's like movies and books because it's not actually important to the plot that it's serving. But if it's, those things are important if you've ever played something like, you played sort of the survival mode in something like the newer Fallout games, right, where you want to take care, you know, you got to make sure that you have food and you have water because you have hunger meters and thirst and radiation you're trying to keep track of, right? All that stuff's important, but it's not important as to serving what is considering the story of something like Fallout 4, where you're kind of searching for your child, right? So it's a different mode, right? It focuses on different things. And the narrative style really kind of cuts everything away that doesn't serve this one sort of line of story. So Hex Crawls kind of fit in that middle, where it's something between the dungeons, but it's also something between the town, and it's something between sort of like the ultimately really, really confined area, whether that's physical confinement of something like a dungeon, right, where you have a very small space you're kind of working with, or it's the sort of broader confines of something like a narrative style where we're cutting away anything to focus specifically on one sort of through line story. And the exploration mode is in a lot of ways sort of the antithesis of that. That's like, it's the open box sandbox style where it's just like you can go anywhere and do anything and make your own fun. That's sort of the idea, right? So it's it feels different, right? We focus on different things, right? This one's very much about player choice. Other one's about sort of the mechanics of the game, whether that's exploring the dungeon and dealing with that sort of investigative part and the combat parts, or focusing specifically on the role play and narrative plot areas, right? So we kind of have these different areas that we can kind of see kind of conform a little bit to what we talk about, sort of like the three pillars, right? You have the exploration pillar, that would clearly be Hex Crawls, right? You have sort of the combat pillar, that's dungeon, because that's a lot of things you're going to be doing in most dungeons, especially in very modern style D&D, right? Whereas in old style D&D, you might want to be looking for ways to avoid combat or get around combat, because it doesn't really serve a purpose for you. And then you have sort of that Hickman, very heavy narrative style, which really, really kind of focuses on the roleplay and character aspect of the game. So, right, we have three pillars, three different types of sort of gameplay that's sort of evolved. And originally, sort of Hex Crawls kind of came out of, its roots are sort of in the outdoor survival board game that kind of comes out with OD&D, where OD&D has a lot of things around, it's really the nuts and bolts of the game at this point, right? The little booklets are short, they don't give us a ton of information. It relies on sort of outside supplements. Like the original D&D asks you to use the chainmail rules, which is Gary Gygax's sort of individual miniature wargaming medieval system for doing combat. It gives you a very bare bones combat system, but it really kind of pushes you towards using a different product. And when it comes to sort of doing anything that's not sort of the dungeon aspect, it kind of tells you to use this board game that already existed, called Outdoor Survival, to sort of talk about traversing the wilderness and getting lost and keeping track of your resources as you're sort of, you know, fumbling around in the wilderness, basically. And so, but that evolved over time. So in probably where it's most well-known sort of coming out is in 1981, sort of the Isle of Dread. And that's sort of the grand sort of introduction to Hex crawling as a fully contained sort of mode of play. And that comes out that is the first adventure for the expert set. The expert is the E in BECME, and it comes after the basic set. So the basic set kind of focuses specifically on the dungeon aspect, and then the expert set starts to introduce things like how to have what they call outdoor adventures. And the Isle of Dread is set up like that. You basically get a blank map and you fill it in as you go, right? As the DM, you really don't know too much about the island, and every time that you play it, the island kind of ends up different. You have basically the shape of it, and you have things that are going to appear on the island, but you don't, in a lot of cases, know specifically where they're going to show up and what's going to kind of be around. So it's sort of like a random generation every time, but it still has very key elements. It's very similar to how a lot of sort of open world games kind of are trending in the video game space. So we see that in something like more like Starfield and other sort of newer games where you have these sort of, we know that there's going to be very specific places on some planets, but then everything else around it is sort of procedurally generated, right? It's all proc gen. And so it's always different kind of every time you play the game, which is kind of important to the game's sort of overall structure for something like Starfield. But it is, it's interesting, right? It's similar yet different each time, which is kind of fun. So this first comes out in the Isle of Dread, which is exceedingly popular, right? It's a new kind of way to play the game. It comes with these new sort of rules about how to do it. Today, like I talked about, it's sort of, I'm getting ahead of myself. So that kind of came out and was popular, and then sort of that Hickman Revolution came in, which brought in an even newer, different style of game that was very sort of character and plot focused, about had this very strong emphasis on story and less emphasis on randomly pillaging dungeons and just kind of traversing the wilderness. You know, kind of this early D&D's very much got this sort of wildcatter, Old West prospector, like I'm going to go out into the wilds and make my fortune, and you know, I'm going to use that as basically the means to better my life, right? That's sort of the idea with that. And then you have that move to the narrative structure, which is like, hey, we're going to focus on telling a very specific sort of story that makes you feel like you and your characters are more taking part in something that's more scripted, like a television show, a movie, a book, right? To give that feeling, which is a very cool feeling. It just feels very different, and it was a very different style. And in a lot of ways, I think that it ended up seeding a lot of TSR's demise in later years, and we saw the hobby sort of expand out, and we saw things that took that concept, that strong narrative concept, and sort of ran with it, and was able to sort of open up a new audience for tabletop role-playing games through things like White Wolf, World of Darkness kind of stuff, where it was like, we're gonna, oh, well, now we can do sci-fi, now we can do sort of modern day, we can do horror, we can do these sort of character forward, very sort of focused narrative, you know, everybody's kind of broody, and it just brought in a different audience that was not originally pulled into D&D, wanting to live sort of that Mines of Moria, Lord of the Rings sort of vibe, right? It brought in a different audience and kind of pushed people in that way. And so for a long time, that kind of hex crawls kind of fell by the wayside, because there's, like we said, they're kind of the antithesis of that very clean, very pared down narrative style of game. But today, you probably, for people who are especially coming from sort of the 5e area, hex crawls are probably most familiar to you as the ideas of West Marches campaigns. If you're a new DM and you're looking for advice and things like that, you've probably come over the concept of a West Marches campaign, and that's very hex crawly for the most part. The idea that you have sort of a home base and this rotating roster, this rogues gallery of potential adventurers, and one or more DMs can come in and be like, hey, I'm thinking about running a game this weekend, here's sort of the time I'm thinking about it. Anybody who wants to show up, you know, you're going to need to looking for characters of about this level, and we're going to head out and, you know, you guys are going to check out this one specific adventure location, or you're just going to get out there and sort of crawl around the surrounding area, and everything that happens in the session needs to be wrapped up, and then you head back to sort of your hub town to rest and recuperate and spend all your gold and level up. It's also familiar through the published adventures from Wizards of the Coast that you'll probably know it as the jungle portion of Tomb of Annihilation. So you land in Cholt, you get a guide, you travel through the jungle trying to find Acerak's lair. And so there's a lot of random encounters and mapping sort of the jungle and having this guide and trying to basically find it, right? That's sort of a key component of basically what would we call sort of like the first act of that game. And then the rest is sort of is primarily a dungeon crawl. But that first part is sort of that you get into the port city, you figure out where you need to go, you get a guide, you go through the jungle trying to find your way. There's all sorts of weird random things, right? There's zombies and dinosaurs and goblin villages and things like that. And again, those are all kind of randomly placed, so if you replay the game again, the dungeon stays the same, the sort of overall story stays the same, the port city stays the same, but that middle portion, that first act, that jungle portion, is always going to be a little bit different, right? It's always going to, depending on the choices that the players make and their characters do, the roles, you're going to end up with something very, very different in that first section, which is sort of the strength of the hex crawl. Is that every time you play it, it's going to be a little random, a little bit different. It's very similar with the traveling aspect of the 10 Towns in Rime of the Frostmaiden. Very similar, right? There's a focus in Rime of the Frostmaiden because this sort of oppressive winter atmosphere that makes survival itself sort of getting between these sort of beacons of light of civilization in the north of the Sword Coast, kind of like that's sort of a important aspect of the overall gameplay and the overall story, right? So this is when we start to see, you see hex crawls kind of being incorporated more into that narrative structure, kind of being in a lot of places, the sort of glue that kind of holds adventure locations together, especially with these longer adventure modules that might have sort of multiple dungeons involved with them, that exploration can kind of step in and kind of apply that sort of glue. So that's sort of the basics over. So you might be wondering, all right, so I kind of get it, but I also don't want to, maybe I'm only familiar, if you're a newer DM, only familiar with that sort of heavy narrative style play, and you understand dungeons because you probably run some dungeons, and so you know that, and it's very easy to just take a dungeon and make it bigger, right? You just add new levels to it, which in its own way is just basically like stacking multiple dungeons on top of each other. So it's a very intuitive way of play, but then you get to sort of the exploration outdoor aspect, and then especially in 5e, you don't get a lot of official support through things like the DMG and, you know, those sort of official dungeon master resources to really kind of give you any ammunition to sort of like make that, right? This edition of D&D, incredibly popular, right? Very fun to play, doesn't give DMs a lot of tools, and especially doesn't give them tools for situations outside of combat for those other pillars. It gives you some for social and gives you some very bare bones things for exploration, but beyond that, it's sort of like, well, you just gotta make it up, right? You're even making it up on the spot, right? Kind of putting that load back on the DM, and that's especially heavy for something like prep, which is, I think that the amount of prep to run a hex crawl is really low. Now, if you're a really, really prep heavy DM or GM, you kind of step in, you might be like, okay, well, I've got to map out this entire sandbox for my players to run around in. But you kind of learn as you do it that you don't need to be that far in front of the players, and that you can actually take a lot of load off of yourself in your session prep by grabbing some like random tables for points of interest and dressing and sort of travel encounters, and you can get sort of a handful of drop-in dungeons and some rumors and adventure seeds, maybe a short list of like factions or power players for that sort of narrative area, something that's tied to the characters and backstory and their backstories, and you give them some motivation, and then you kind of have everything you need to run a hex crawl. And you actually don't need to, you can actually play it in a style that allows you to discover things that happen on the map as the players uncover them, as their PCs sort of move through the world, as the party moves through the world. You can also be surprised by that, and then still feel like you have sort of the framework, the scaffolding behind you to be like, oh, well, so it looks like they came across a dungeon. Well, I've got a handful of dungeons sort of right here at my disposal. Short dungeons, like 5-room dungeons, 1-page dungeons, those sorts of things for the most part. Be like, okay, well, this seems like this is a good place for that, you know, orc encampment that I was talking about, that I thought would be fun to run. And so you grab that out and be like, okay, well, this is sort of the dungeon that you end up kind of coming across. Rather than have to sort of plan this all out very heavily, you can kind of do that, and then you can have the players give you a lot of help for their own sort of personal player character motivations to be the impetus for like going and doing things in the world, which is really, really helpful from a DM perspective, when you can be like, okay, you tell me what you guys want to do. Like, what goals do your characters have? What are they trying to achieve? What do they want to get through adventuring? And once you have sort of that motivation, what their sort of personal end goal is, you can use that as fodder for your ideas for throwing things into that sort of hex crawling sandbox that are going to help facilitate what they're kind of looking for their characters. And now we're talking sort of about, so we're going to, before we jump right into my basic hex crawling rules, kind of talk about sort of why I kind of made these rules and how they're maybe a little bit different than some of the other things that maybe you've checked out or maybe you haven't yet. If you haven't checked them out, I say, you know, do a little bit of research. They're kind of all over the place. There are a lot of different systems out there for hex crawling, and a lot of them are perfectly good, and they might be your cup of tea, and you use them. The ones that I came across, I liked, but there are parts of me that a lot of them don't really address issues that I have that I want addressed by a system that they didn't really do for me. Like for instance, I feel like a lot of hex crawl systems I came across in my own personal research and developing, that ended up into me sort of like developing my own system, kind of came from them being very formulaic, and they treat PCs like the party sort of like exploration robots. By that I mean like they always have this much movement in a day, and that's modified by hard numbers through X, Y, and Z terrain, and through things like weather, and whether they have beasts of burdens or mounts and those sorts of things. So everything, you can basically sit down with a chart and figure out how far they're going to get in a hex crawl, and where they're going to get to, and how they're going to get there. Which is okay, but that has not been my experience doing things like backpacking, things like that. And like I said, it's all static. There's no like dice rolls that are involved with that. There's no interaction. So basically you're like, PCs might go, okay, we want to travel to that next hex. And then the DM's like, okay, so there's this many of you. You go at this pace, and this is the slowest person, so I take their pace and I times it by this distance, so that's how much time it will take. But this is also on a graded uphill slope, which is actually going to make them slower, which means it's going to take more time, right? And meanwhile, the players are just kind of sitting there twiddling their thumbs like, are we moving on to the next hex, or like what's going on? So I wanted to do something that's got a little bit more interaction for the DM and players, like some more dice rolling that kind of confirm things. There's a little bit more chance, a little bit more randomness. Things I feel like mine kind of gives you this ability that there's more chances that things are going to happen. There's more chances that your plans are maybe not going to work out because, right, where people are not like cars and we can't just estimate how far they're going to get every single time, right? We're not scientific. We're not quite that scientific and set up in our movements, right? We can't quite do that. So I wanted something that's got that. It's got a little bit more player choice, a little bit more interactivity for how they address things. And I wanted to, so I sort of basically incorporated some ideas from some already existing systems, and then kind of looked at how I can make those like a little bit more interactive, and kind of ended up in kind of piecing together my own system and replacing parts and kind of Theseus shipping, kind of pulling everything together to make an amalgamation that is in its own way very, very distinct. And so that's what we're gonna go over. And before the very last thing, I promise, before we kind of go over that, is I want to talk about and it's quickly the difference between exploration and overland travel. These are not the same things. They kind of often get confused, I think, especially for new players and new DMs. Like sometimes those kind of say, okay, well, if you're traveling between locations, and those are the same thing. But they're, in my mind, and I think in a lot of people's, or at least sort of veteran dungeon masters, game masters, these are not the same thing, right? They're sort of like a Venn diagram. They have some overlap, but they're not the same. Exploration's about sort of like going off the beaten track and like finding something that's sort of like machetes through the jungle kind of style play, where you're looking for things and trying to discover things, and you're going to come across a bunch of stuff that you're not expecting, and you're going to deal with that. And you may not find the place that you're looking for, right? You may end up getting lost, you may not find it. Whereas overland travel is like, okay, you have a definitive sort of endpoint, and you have a pretty good idea of where it is. And in most cases, you have a very structured way to get there, right? That might be a series of roads, it might be taking a ship, right? Something like that. Like, there are established sort of routes of travel for you to generally get from where you are to where you're trying to get. And really, for overland travel, I think that's where I start to look at things where, all right, going hex by hex is not important, right? That's not facilitating what we're trying to do. We're literally trying to get you from maybe one adventure to the next adventure, and going over hundreds and hundreds of miles, hex by small hex by small hex by small hex, looking at them by hour and hour and day, and even in some cases week by week, is not particularly important. That's not what we're trying to focus on, right? My assumption being that if the party's moving from one location to another established location, they have a very specific goal that they're trying to get, and they don't want to get sidetracked on that. They're not looking to get sidetracked on it. Whereas somebody who's doing exploration things, discovery is a big part of that sort of idea of gameplay. So coming across, some random ruins, you might be like, okay, well, we're gonna take a diversion and plumb these ruins and see what's in there and see if we can get some treasure and, powerful items, things like that. Or at the same time, you might be like, we're under a time limit, so we need to go. We're still trying to find what we're looking for back here, but we're going to map this down so that way we can potentially come back to it later. It's slightly different. It's just a slightly different mode of gameplay. So I believe that is it. So let's go ahead, and what we're going to do is I will show you guys what I'm looking at. We're going to look directly at sort of my hex crawling operations, which is what a lot of people have looked at, and then we'll kind of look at the map and see kind of how those fit together. So let me swap over so you guys can kind of see what I'm looking at. Boom. Alright, here we go. So 1123, that's sort of like the last time I updated this document, basically. As I'm always making, and I think that most DMs do this, you're always kind of making little tweaks as you're going along. So this is sort of the hex crawling operations that I generally use. So we have this, we're going to ignore basically this top part for right now, because this is not, it's at the top of the document because it's the one that I use, the section that I end up using the most, right, that I need to reference the most. But it's not the first thing that you need to do, right? The first thing you need to do is actually down here, is in sort of like the morning travel prep. And this is basically your starting point. This is either you setting out from some sort of safe haven, whether that's an inn, a roadside inn, or your hub town, or whatever it is, and you need to, as the end, that's sort of the steps we go through. The first thing I do is sort of update the calendar date. I think it's really important to sort of have a calendar so that way you can kind of track time. Tracking time is important in the game, as far as sort of resources and adventure time limits, those sort of timers, those countdowns, things like that. As well as just kind of, it gives you this idea of a passage of time. And can really, from DM's perspective, kind of help you incorporate more downtime and help you kind of deal with things that kind of become more of an issue, especially in newer styles of game where you have adventurers that go from level 1 to like level 5 in 2 or 3 weeks of adventuring just because of the XP leveling. Like that's just how it ends up going, especially those first levels pass really quickly. And so this kind of allows you as a DM to kind of look at how much time is actually passing in game, and you can kind of pump the brakes on something, kind of create spaces between some adventures, right? There's a lot of sort of triggers that kind of countdowns for timers that sort of like escalate tension, and then this kind of gives you an ability to do some downtime and sort of de-escalate that tension and kind of give that like long exhale. I kind of give the players and sort of the overall game pace that sort of exhale to just chill out for a second. And you also want to, obviously you want to cover that in exploration, because usually you're going to have some sort of time limit or frame. Or maybe you just want to make sure that the travel takes the amount of time that it is, just so you can think about factions in your world and how what other things are kind of going on in the world as the characters sort of explore, whether that's changing the weather, which is what we're going to talk about next. So whether it's changing the weather or whether like conflicts are happening, adventuring seasons, and things like that, right? Holidays, rituals, rites, those sorts of things, they kind of come up. But also we want to update the weather, so we're going to update the calendar, and then I usually update the weather. If you've watched the solo RPG, you know that I basically just kind of I roll a bunch of sort of basically weather conditions in one lump sum, and then just kind of throw it in document and be like, okay, well, every day that goes by, just tick off another one. And I use sort of like a hex flower setup. So if that's something you're interested in doing, if you want me to go over that aspect too, just drop a comment down below and talk about it. See if there's enough interest in that sort of thing, then I'll cover it. If not, there are a lot of weather systems out there, you'll find them. So we update the calendar, we set the weather, and we make some adjustments as necessary to sort of our travel pace. So this is the first sort of like mechanic aspect. You might go, okay, what's the travel pace? So the travel pace is basically, everybody basically makes a constitution saving throw at the beginning of the day on the outset of adventure. Basically be like, this is how I feel in the morning, right? Sometimes you wake up and you feel great, you've got a bunch of energy, you slept well, everything's good to go, you have a good breakfast, you're ready to take on the day. Other days you're like, I did not sleep well. Or, maybe you're feeling a little ill, or maybe you've got blisters on your feet, or, you slept wrong and now you've got this crick in your neck, right? There's something about that experience that means like there's some days you're just like not in it to win it, right? You just don't have the gas to get there. And this sort of, again, right off the bat, we're trying to get those players involved with roles, so we're doing that. That's what I'm looking to do. And they're going to be the masters of their own destiny, right? You're going to see people who are playing classes like fighter, barbarian, paladin. They have those higher constitution scores. Most days they're ready to go, right? They're in pretty good physical shape most of the time. And then you're going to have people like your wizards, probably. Most of your spellcasters, they probably don't have particularly good constitution modifiers, and they don't get any bonuses to constitution saving throws. And so there's very often that they might, your wizard travels for 2 hours and they're like, I'm doubled over, and they're like, I am beat. I don't know if I can go on, guys. Like, I got this heavy spell book I'm carrying around. Like, I spent most of my time in the library. I did not do a lot of running. What can I say? I didn't do a lot of laps around the track. Right? And it was not part of my education. Most of it was reading. Sitting in a book. Sitting in a chair with a book, reading. And not doing those sort of physical activity. So we're trying to kind of show that off as well. And I look at sort of applying advantage and disadvantage for their constitution saving throws based off of, do they have mounts or beasts of burden that are carrying their gear, so they're not having to walk around carrying a whole bunch of gear, right? That makes it easier to walk around. You can go further in the day when you're not loaded down. Looking at things like morale, we'll talk about the morale in a little bit. Rather than sort of like add in an entire morale system. It's just sort of an optional kind of thing, that kind of something for the player characters to do once they get into camp at the end of the day. Other things like the weather, that's one of those adjustments we were looking for. It's like, okay, we just came up with this in the solo RPG series, right? Last time, they were walking through heavy rain, and that makes everything really muddy, and it's really a pain in the butt, and it's just, right, it just doesn't feel good. That's not an ideal walking around sort of weather, right? Heavy rain and mud and all that stuff. So don't get a lot of accomplished that day unless you really try to push yourself. And then we just go, once I jot that stuff down, we go immediately into the hex crawl actions. And so this is basically the three choices kind of players have as they're sort of going through the hex crawl system. All right, you're in a hex right now. Do you want to search this hex for a point of interest, or do some other sort of interaction within this hex? So if you were, let's say you stopped across, you're doing your little hex crawl, and you end up running across well, that would be a point of interest, wouldn't it? So that's not a great example. I was going to use an example. You run across a village, and maybe you want to do something in that village, but you're not going to be doing that because that would be a point of interest. So something that's not a point of interest. So if you decide that you're going for a while, and then let's say you enter a wooded area, and you're like, oh, well, this would be a really great place. We're kind of running low on supplies. I want to forage for some supplies. Okay, so you're going to take an action in the hex, and that's going to cause a roll along that sort of travel pace track that we'll get to. So everything you do during the day builds up towards that travel pace, which we'll talk about in just a second. And then the other thing you can do is, we're in one hex, we want to go to the next hex. Travel to a new hex. And then sort of like the third thing you can do is end your travel day. So you're either moving, you're doing something in the hex you're in, or you're deciding, at this point we're actually going to make camp, or stay at the inn, or whatever it is. So every time that we do the player characters do one of these actions, we roll a d4. Sometimes I might do that. I might call on one of the players to do it. We might go around the horn. We'll go around the table and be like, okay, roll the d4 for this one. Okay, now you roll the d4, you roll the d4, you roll the d4. And then maybe at the end, maybe I'm like, okay, I'll roll the d4, right? Again, we're trying to keep everybody trying to keep it interactive, and everybody feel like, especially for the players, they get to roll dice, and they feel like they have some limited amount of control, even if that control is just over the chance of playing the game, of going through this method. And so we apply any situational modifiers to that, so weather, terrain, sneaking, gear, etc. So we might look at weather. Usually we'll do at the beginning. You can run weather, depending on the weather system you're using. If you're using a weather system where weather changes, it's really granular, and you want to change it by even down to basically the hour or so, right? You might have, instead of doing that advantage or disadvantage at the top of that saving throw, you might do it here with a d4. And it works just like a d20 roll, advantage, disadvantage at 5e. If you have advantage, you roll the d4 twice, and this time you take the lowest number. Low numbers are good in this aspect because we're building up. Or you have disadvantage, in which you're going to roll twice and take the higher. But it might be, poor weather usually, or exceedingly good weather. I'll give you a bonus if the weather's really, really good, right? It's sunny, it's incredibly temperate, there's no precipitation or very low precipitation or humidity in the air. It's just like, it's a nice day. Okay, so you travel a little bit further because the conditions are really, really nice. You might look at things like terrain, right? Might get a bonus if you come across a road and you're following a road or some other sort of game path, animal trail. You might have disadvantage, if you're going across sand, right? Sand's kind of very difficult to walk across if you're going through sort of like a desert hex. Dealing with something like grades, if you're going over mountains, right? Probably going to give you disadvantage on that because that's just way more difficult to do than walking on a flat plane. I might give you Disadvantage if you're trying to sneak, right? The benefit of sneaking is that you're less likely to come into a random encounter or be able to sort of disengage from a random encounter before before it actually gets on top of you. So if you're doing that, but you're also taking more time, so we're going to increase the pace. And then gear, so that's sort of things we talked about, something like Rime of the Frostmaiden and 10 Towns, where it's like, okay, but you need like good, like, do you have heavy winter gear? Because you were traveling through a heavy snowy area. No, but it's really cold, even if there's not like maybe snow on the ground that's actually impeding your footwear. But if like there's high winds and it's just really, really cold, and you don't have the proper gear for that, then you're probably you're not gonna be able to stay out there as long, right? That's basically what we're doing. So what we do is basically increase the travel pace and roll Constitution saves if the PCs decide to push. So what are we talking about? What are we talking about with travel pace? The easiest way to do this is to probably kind of show you. All right, so let's say, let's jump over the dice roller. Let's say, just for this example, let's say it's solo. It's a solo game, so we're only dealing with one PC, just for example purposes. And let's say it's a fighter, and they have a +2 to Constitution, and they have proficiency in Constitution, so they have a +4 to their Constitution save. They're like, all right, well, it's the start of the day, and okay, I rolled an 8 +4, so 12. So I can go 12 amount without needing to sort of like strain myself. Okay, we go into that first hex. 3. Okay, we go into the next hex. 6. And we just start adding up the total as they do more actions. Alright, 7. Okay, we didn't come across a point of interest. Is there a point of interest in this hex? I'm going to search it to see if I find one. Okay, you take some time to search. And you find one, but it's town. You decide you don't really need to stay in town. You kind of look through your gear. You're like, I think I'm okay on gear, so I'm just going to keep going. Alright, you're at 9 of 12. Going to our next hex. Alright, that was a nice easy jaunt. Keep moving. 12, alright, and at this point, we're looking at the meets or beats sort of area. Alright, our travel pace was 12. We've now hit 12. So, at this point, you think of roleplay style, you're like, okay, your fighter feels like they're starting to feel fatigued, right? Like, they can go on, but doing that, it has the potential to start to give me levels of exhaustion. So maybe they know where they're going to, and they're like, yeah. Like, yeah, I'm in the wilderness now, but I know, let's say the adventure location I'm trying to get to is, I know it's 2 hexes that way. So, I can push it, and I can get there, and then rest, and we can take on the dungeon. Because maybe we want to save our supplies because we want to be in the dungeon longer. So we're like, alright, well, I'm going to push it, and we're going to see how it goes. Alright, so we push it. We go to the next hex. 1 hex away. 13, okay. So once we hit that meter beat threshold, the player characters now need to start making active saves against the new travel pace. Okay, alright, they have a +4. So they need to roll at least a 9. Okay. So they push themselves, they feel alright. The fighter feels okay. Alright, I'm good. Let's go on to the next hex. Ooh, well that one's kind of tough. It's really a struggle to sort of get into the adventure location itself. Maybe that's a lot of time kind of looking around for it, right? Maybe it's a hidden cave entrance and you just spend a bunch of the time kind of, you know that you're in the area, but you're literally kind of looking for it. So up to 17, now we have to make a Constitution save against this new DC, which is 17, right? The longer they go, the harder it is to push themselves to keep going on and not start getting exhausted from that. They do that, we're going to roll our shots. But we're a fighter, we rolled well, and we got +4. So with the 23, we're fine. So we arrive perfectly fine, but let's say we're in the party with that wizard. That wizard may or may not have made those last 2 saves, and in fact, has probably made more saves. So let's say that the wizard was going to do this, right? So they have their own personal, and you can run it as a group, right? But I feel like it works better when everybody has their own individual aspect to it, and it really doesn't add a lot of management for the DM side It's like taking down initiative. You have their numbers, and you're just taking a tally next to the numbers and addressing the lowest DC thresholds as you come across them. It's really not, it's not difficult, there's not a lot of cognitive load to it. You're going to be doing the same thing anyways. It's just easier to be like, well, you know, the wizard, being frustrated with a wizard who doesn't, you know, put any points in their constitution score. And you're like, you're really keeping us from traveling further, right? You're always slowing us down, which feels like what would happen, right? That feels intuitive. That your spellcasters that don't have those characters that don't have high constitutions are more likely to be the ones that kind of slow the group down when they're traveling over land, right? When they're you know, bushwhacking and cutting through the wilderness and, you know, going over the hills and traveling across deserts. Right, you have your warrior style characters, and they have really good constitution and really good athletics, and it feels appropriate that they're good at this. Then you have the wizards who don't have that. So let's say that we were going to roll for our wizard, and we'll just give our wizard flat. They didn't dump constitution, which don't do that. If you're making wizards, don't dump your constitution. You don't have enough hit points as it is already. So it's just a flat roll for them, for their DC for the day. So we're just do the same DC for the day, just on a flat roll, and we rolled a 5. So that means they made it precisely this far. They made it to the second hex, and then they have to start making active saves. So 7 will be the third one. Okay, they make that one. 9 is the next one. And they have to make active saves every time we go. Okay, they just barely made 9. So they barely made 9. Can they make 10? Oh, they barely make 10. And so you're pushing this wizard, right? Come on, man. Keep going. We're almost there. Come on. Can they make 12? They do not make 12. So at this point, they gain a level of exhaustion. Alright, it's just the first level of exhaustion. In 5e, all that means is that you have negatives to ability checks and skill checks, right? You're okay. We can keep pushing, right? You can keep pushing. Yeah, I guess so. I guess I can keep pushing, right? So it's like, alright, well, roll a 13 or better. You can do this. No, I don't. Now I've taken the second level of exhaustion. Now it's down to attacks, I think is the second level. I can't remember if it's also saves. And I'm not going to dig out my reference. It's attacks, but it may also be saves. I can't remember. And at this point, you're like, okay, well, we're probably going to have to stop for the wizard. Right? We're gonna have to do something about that, because now they're at the second level of exhaustion, and now they're not very effective in combat. So now there's a decision by the group. It's like, okay, do we take some sort of rest here? Do we use some sort of magic spell that's going to remove exhaustion if we have that? You know, if we have a cleric in our party who can do, I think lesser restoration gets rid of levels of exhaustion fatigue, so you could do something like that to try to build them back up and get them going. You might have decided to do something like Long Strider or something like that that's going to give, in which case I give you like advantage on one of these rolls as you're on a few of these rolls, as sort of like you're going through that because you get that bonus because you're going faster as a group. But it kind of gives you, we're setting the opportunities for the players to make choices, right? That's what we want them to do. And have to think about how they travel and how they go around the world and how they get into things and how they approach things. So I feel like I'm being successful as a DM when I get to a point where I can just sit back and let the players discuss what they're going to do. I have presented the situation and now some sort of obstacle, and now they're trying to figure out how they're going to go over, around, under, or through it, right? So do we push? Do we keep pushing for the wizard, knowing that they could fatigue themselves to a point where they're not going to be effective in combat? And also remember, basically for every one of these dice, every one of these hexes that we're moving, we're also going to be rolling for random encounters. There's also the potential that they could run in, as they're traveling there, again, this is one adventuring day, they might run into 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, 6, 7, 8 potential combats, right? Not outright combats, that's not how I run it. you could run it that way. I would advise you not to. But 8 potential encounters they might run across. And we'll talk about that in just a second. So the idea is like, there's a chance that you're going to have a lot of random encounters in this system, which I think is good. It kind of shows there's always this chance that you're going to be running across things, and the more you travel and the longer you go, the more likely you are to run into some sort of fight. We see that if you watch the solo RPG series that I do over on the channel, you've seen that we'll be like, okay, well, we only got to make it like 4 hexes to the adventure location. So we're going to go there, and then immediately we get waylaid by random encounters. That just happened, not in this last session, but in the session before, where I ended up rolling, we got 2 hexes, and each hex had a random encounter in it, right? Back-to-back random encounters, or fights. Turned into fights. But that doesn't, they don't necessarily have to be fights. But this idea, but those random encounters are usually smaller. They're not super huge drag-out fights most of the time. They're usually like very light skirmishes. Basically, you come across some sort of wild animal, or maybe, like in the case of, I was just talking about in the solo RPG, the remnants of noble raiders that we had already fought. And so we have sort of a short combat. People, the PCs get to the point, I use that morale system, so the PCs get to the point where they have the clear advantage, and then the rest of the bad guys kind of bug off, and then the players have to decide, okay, do we heal, do we keep moving, what are we going to do now? Right, kind of setting these sort of minor hiccups, these little minor obstacles in front of the players, so they're trying to get to the place that they're trying to get to in a way that's sort of engaging and is fun to play through, and feels difficult, but not in a way that, well, what I'm trying to say is that rather than just kind of doing it ad hoc, like a lot of DMs do, is like, okay, you guys are traveling you're trying to get to the dungeon, so I'll roll on the random encounter table. Okay, you guys are fighting, it looks like 6 wild boars. Like, okay, but why are we stopping to fight these things? Those sorts of things. You're like, I don't really understand this, but it's like, oh no, we'd set it up like, with my system, it'd be like, okay, you're crawling through the forest, you've been going through the forest, you're making a bunch of ruckus, you end up walking into basically the sort of like home stomping grounds of this pack of wild hogs, and these wild boars are territorial, and you're in their territory, so they're going to attack, and you're going to have to deal with that, or try to scare them off, or try to go around them, right? If they pick up the encounter early enough, they might be like, okay, well, they might notice the markings, rubbings on trees and things like that, and be like, okay, we need to make a wide berth, or else we're going to end up fighting some wild hogs, and we don't really want to do that. So it gives you a lot of options, basically. But yeah, that's the basic bones of the system, and then we just kind of layer some extra stuff on it, because we want, like I said, that's not what I'm looking for. We're looking for things for them to do. So, right, every time they move, they get any sort of situational advantages or disadvantages. We take that into account, and then we increase those travel paces, and they roll Constitution saves actively if the PCs are pushing themselves, which means they've hit that travel pace threshold. Before that, everything is dandy. They don't need to make any saves, anything like that. They made that initial save, which again sort of represents their natural, how they feel in the day, right? How much energy they have, and sort of, their physical constitution, literally their physical constitution. That's what we're looking at. So what happens when you take one of these actions? Well, the first one is entering a new hex, so we'll talk about that. So you go, okay, we're going to enter the new hex. So the first thing we need to do is say, if I'm doing a method where I haven't built the sandbox beforehand, and we're doing it ad hoc, we're doing it as we play, we're going to do it live, right? If we're playing that style of game, which I do both, so it just kind of depends on what I'm trying to do in the campaign. So if we're doing a new hex, we may not know what that next hex is. So when we're in the hex, this is when this kind of comes in. I'm like, okay, so we're in a hex that's on the border. Let's say, I think I have this up. So let's say we were hex crawling, and we get to this area. All right, so this is a little grasslands hex at the very edge of the forest. Well, I don't know what's around that, right? We don't know what's around that. So maybe we know that we need to get like somewhere over here. So we're kind of interested in what's going to be in these two hexes, or sort of ways, because there could be mountains here. We want to make sure that that's not the case, as we are going to pick the sort of terrain that's most advantageous for the party to kind of go through, especially if it's going to be a hex that's going to allow them to get closer to their destination, while also getting advantage on that travel pace roll, right? So it costs them less points to sort of get through the hex, so they can move further, right? Because they're trying to get to a destination, presumably. So say we're here and we're like, okay, well, I need to figure out sort of like the biomes, what's actually kind of in those hexes. So that's when I jump out the D2 or the 2D6. All right, 5. So let's say we started out from this village, we traveled boop, 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 and, or technically, I guess technically we know what some of these hexes are, but we just picked a point to start from. So we're starting from here. All right, so we know that this place is another sort of plains, grasslands area. What's next to it? Same thing. Same thing. And same thing. All right. So we are good to go whichever direction we go. So we see us sort of leave this heavy forest into this plains area. Like, okay, well, if we're trying to get this way, then obviously we're probably just going to take the most direct route. There. We'll move into this hex. And so that's what we're talking about. We're moving into a new hex. So go, all right, you guys have made that. We're going to roll that 1d4. We're going to add that to your travel pace. And then I might roll it. I might have one of the characters or one of the players roll it. All right, somebody rolled me a d12 and somebody rolled me a d20. All right, so the first player is going to roll that d12. They basically don't want to get a 12 or a 1. They don't, so we don't have any sort of random encounter that shows up. And we don't have any dressing. So basically, instead, most hex systems use a 1d6. I use a d12, but there's 2. Whether you roll a 1 or a 12 kind of depends on what happens. If it's 1, it's probably going to be some sort of creature encounter, most likely a fight, but not necessarily, depending on who kind of shows up and how the PCs approach it. And then on the other spectrum, we have basically dressing, which is basically some very, very soft creature encounters, or most of the time non-creature encounters. These would be things you come across like, oh, there's a stream that you need to cross, there's a ravine, or you see a shepherd, moving their flock around, that sort of thing. Things that are just sort of a little bit more sort of like crumbles of world building and places to interact with. They might, in the case of something like that shepherd, the players might opt to stop and talk to this shepherd. If they're locals, they might know something about the area. Maybe they can get directions. They can get information about points of interest, things that are going on, potential adventure seeds, things like that. They can get that sort of thing. Or maybe they're like, hey, we need to resupply. Can you tell me where your village is so we can maybe buy some supplies? So that way, maybe they want to maybe we'll look at this and be like, okay. It says that their village is that way, so maybe we go check out that village and we can resupply before we go to the dungeon or whatever our adventure location is that we're trying to get to. So just kind of give them that. And then we also want to do the point of interest occurrence, the POI occurrence. So we roll a d20. Again, I might roll it, they might roll it. They want low numbers on this roll. That's not a low number, so there's no point of interest. They don't come across a point of interest. Now, that doesn't mean that there's not a point of interest in that hex. It just means that they just didn't come across it, right, while they were traveling, because they're not actively looking for it. That'll change if they decide to actively look for it, right? That's one of the things that we talk about, right? That's one of the things called actions. Well, we can search this actual hex and see if there's a point of interest in it. So we'll run into the point of interest, and then that incurs another sort of pace roll. Well, you spend more time in the hex, more time goes by in the day, you exert yourself kind of searching around. There you go. And so, let's say that you wanted to search the hex. What does that look like? Okay, well, you go to the searching current hex sort of area in my system. Alright, so it's usually a 1d6. It's a 1d10 if you're in sort of like a coastal hex, which we don't have any on this map. So we would just be rolling the d6. Again, this is why we use the low numbers. That's why we're looking for the low numbers, because the low numbers are on all these dice, basically. And if we roll this 1d6, if we spend the time to search the hex, no matter what we roll, we're going to know for certain whether there is a point of interest or there is not a point of interest in here. It's not an investigation check. It's not a perception check. It's the payment for figuring that out is the time you spend here. Which, if you're trying to get someplace, you're probably not going to do. Let's be honest. You're probably not going to do that, right? But if you're just out, you know, doing a very sort of West Marches hex crawl where you're just like, it's discovery, we're just trying to get rich quick, you know, finding places like dungeons and things like that. Unexplored wilderness around our starting village, right? We have our sort of starting village here. Right here in this hex. And maybe we're just traveling around, just trying to adventure and sort of make our fortune to change our lot in life. Or whatever reason the characters want insane wealth and powerful items. Whatever their personal character motivation is for that. And so I go, alright, well we moved in this hex and we're going to spend time searching the hex. We'll pay the toll. Alright, so we add 2 to the travel pace. Do we find anything? 6. So 6 on... doesn't matter. That's never going to hit. That's a no. There's not a point of interest here. But the point of interest occurrence is broken up. I've talked about this in some other videos, but the Heartlands marches in wild sort of style of gameplay, with the Heartlands being like this is the heart of civilization, and then outside of that, if you want to think about it, sort of like rings of a target. So you have sort of the center, and then the marches is sort of like the frontier area around sort of like the most civilized part, and then on the outside of that is of course the deep wilds. And so this kind of tells you, we can look at this sort of POIs and give you. So you'll see if we roll a 6, there's nothing. Right, and then we have this just to remind me that, hey, if I roll this on the d6, it's confirmed that there is no point of interest in this. And again, if I'm using HexCML and we're here, I would just actually go in here and, well, I wouldn't do it in there, but I'd do it here. I would just add a little note for myself. Or actually, I wouldn't even just say confirmed. I would just say empty. That's all I'd say for my note for myself. Hey, there's no point of interest here. I know there's no point of interest. They spent the time specifically searching this hex to see if they found any. They didn't. We know it's empty. Which, you know, depending on how you play the game, if you want the players to document a lot of this stuff, you might not tell them if they ever come back to this hex whether or not they've explored it. It might be one of the things where they spend the time to explore the hex again, and then the result, you just let them know, hey, as you start to search the hex, this area, you realize that a lot of it seems really familiar, and after a while you realize that, oh yeah, we've definitely been here, and we should have remembered that there's not a point of interest here. Or you can be a very gracious and magnanimous DM and be like, you remember this place, maybe you only did it a few days ago. You're like, yeah, you remember that farmhouse, you remember that weird gnarled tree. You know that there's not a point of interest here. You remember searching this area, talking to some people here, and there wasn't anything of interest as far as adventuring here for you to deal with. But let's say, for the sake of saking, that we did, and let's focus. Well, before we jump onto that, so you'll notice that depending on whether you're in the Heartlands, the Marches, or the Wilds, depends on how likely it is that you're going to come across a point of interest. So in the Wilds, it's extremely unlikely. If your players have pushed into the deep wilds, it's just unlikely that they're going to come across those sort of classic points of interest that tend to be things like tombs and dungeons and settlements and some sort of civilized things or landmarks that are known, things of that nature. It's unlikely that less likely they're going to come across those sorts of things. Now, usually in my games, I try to stay very much in that sort of marches area, that sort of frontier area. And if you're going through that sort of marches area, sort of on the fringe of civilization, where a lot of, right, the borderlands, right, we have an entire module named after it. It's where a lot of adventuring happens. So in that case, there's about a 50% chance that you're going to come across a point of interest in any tile if you look for it. Any sort of hex tile if you're going to look for it. And then if you get in the Heartlands, like we said, is the heart of civilization. There is a 5 out of 6 chance that you're going to run across a point of interest. Like, because everything's very densely packed. That's the idea. Everything's very densely packed in the Heartlands, and if you go in the marches, everything's a little bit more spread out. And if you go into the wilds, everything's really spread out. So it's less and less likely you'll come across things. Which means you're going to spend a lot of time in some place like the wilds as you're doing that sort of hex crawl exploring, where you're going to be coming across more random encounters and that random dressing for the wilderness than you are actual adventure locations. So it's a lot of, when you get deep into the wilds, it's more about sort of the resource management of dealing with your rations and taking care of your animals and taking care of yourselves, taking care of the party, that sort of thing. And it's less about stumbling over dungeons and villages, every few miles. That's not going to happen. So it's slightly different. And you will notice that distance-wise, this is all very agnostic. I have a very specific hex system that's set up with very specific distances, but you could drop this into any sort of distance system you wanted to use. If you want to use hexes, you can use hexes. If you want to use squares, you can use squares. Those squares could be 10 miles, they could be 6 miles, they could be 2 miles, right? They could be any size you want. And you just need to adjust a little bit as far as sort of the flavor of the narrative for it. So mine is pretty much set around adventuring days, but that might be difficult if you're doing like 10-mile hexes to be like, oh, well, they could travel like in our example, they travel what, like 8 hexes? I think, do I still have, no, I don't have that. I believe they travel 8 hexes. Well, that would be like 80 miles. We're probably not going to do that in a day. So you might decide that that's more of a weekly sort of check. As I said, so you got to like tweak the information a little bit if you're going to do that. But for any hex crawl system that's basically spent around closer to traveling what somebody might do in like an hour or so, or in a few hours, like 1 to 3 hours, this is probably going to work really well without a lot of kind of fiddly narrative tweaking to make it kind of make sense. So I also want to draw attention to, you'll notice in the Heartlands here, there's a chance on the POI type that you're going to roll a D12 or a D20. That's because the points of interest 1 through 12 are very, very civilized coded. We're talking about more likely you're going to run across settlements, more likely you're going to run across keeps and castles and fortifications and things like that. More likely you're going to run across temples and monasteries and ritual sites and things like that. You're going to run across more things like traveler roadside inns, things of that nature. You're going to run across more bridges and crossings. You're going to run across more beacons and watchtowers and directional signage that kind of tells you where you are and how to get to places. Right, you're going to have a lot more of those in the Heartlands area. As you move further and further out, you're going to have less of those very sort of like humanoid society, cultural kind of things. And more random. The last 8 are a lot more not humanoid specific. More sort of random wild things you might run across. So, like I said, you roll a d6 if you're doing most of that in land crawling. If you are on the coast or you're in sort of like a big sort of inland water hexes, so in the solo campaign we're running, right, that we're kind of pulling through, right, we have the Split Valley Oasis that has a very large lake, that sort of it, and we take boats across that lake and up and down the rivers that kind of feed the lake pretty often. And so we know when we're doing that, we're rolling a d10 for the point of interest, because it's less likely that we're going to have a point of interest in the middle of the lake. That sort of thing. The same way about less likely to have it as you're traveling sort of the coast of the land if you were doing that. And if you get out into sort of like the deeper ocean, then instead of rolling a d6 or a d10, you roll a d100. And so now you're looking at, for something like the Heartlands, if you're in a deep ocean hex with heartlands, which is pretty weird, not impossible, but pretty weird, unlikely to happen, you're looking at a 5% chance that you're going to come across a point of interest, which is pretty low. And then if you're in the wilds, which most of it is, you have a 1% chance of running across anything. So pretty unlikely that you're gonna, if you spend the time to search the wilds in the deep ocean, that you're gonna come across a point of interest. I don't know why you would be trolling around so slowly in a sailing ship in the middle of the ocean looking for a point of interest. Maybe you're looking specifically for like a Trident city or something like that you don't really know where it is, and that's the sort of adventure that you've set up and thing that they're kind of looking for. Or maybe a very sort of like sunken ship that kind of went down in the middle of the ocean, and you have a good lead about sort of the specific area it's in that you might do something like this. But in general, it's not been my experience that you do a lot of hex crawling in ocean hexes. You could, I just don't know. I just don't know that D&D has a very good framework for doing that, because underwater combat in D&D is not, it's not very favorable for the PCs, let's put it that way. Right, it's really hard to cast spells, weapons don't work very well, drowning's pretty easy if you're underwater like that and you don't have some sort of water breathing spell. You also have some very, very strict time elements about things about water breathing, or air bubble if you're using those sorts of spells. That's sort of what we're kind of focusing on. So it's not impossible, but it is extremely unlikely that you would do that. And then we're going to jump into sort of say we come across a point of interest, what it's going to look like. Let's actually do that. So let's say that we moved into this point of interest and I rolled something else, and we're actually going to have a point of interest there. And so we'll generate a point of interest, what that might look like. Or actually, we'll just do the next two. That'll be easier. So let's just roll the 2d6, right? Alright, 6, so it's going to be the same. And 8, which is also the same. Let's go over here. So let's just go ahead and add those strings in really quickly. Let's say we're getting to our destination. Like, okay. And we're going to move into this hex, and then we'll do a point of interest roll, and we'll assume that we made that point of interest roll, so we know that there's going to be a point of interest there. Yeah, chat. Yeah. They take forever to do anything? Yeah. In any one session could just be that one random encounter. I mean, I think that's more of a D&D systemic problem, right? Combats just take a lot of time. And if you want some free advice, I don't know if that's what you're looking for, but if they don't take time, if they're taking too much time, you have to put the pressure on them. So random encounters is not something they opt into. That's something sort of you opt into as a DM. This is something we kind of talk about. Rolling the d6 is like, hey, and I talk about this specifically, like how to actually use random encounters, specifically in dungeons. So that, hey, you can't just like chill out for 20 minutes in the middle of this dungeon corridor. Like, this is an active ecosystem with monsters in it. That's like going into a busy building in the middle of the day and like sitting down the hallway and be like, I hope nobody runs across us in this building. It's like, well, yeah, they are. And so if you sit here and have that, I'm going to start rolling dice. And if you guys aren't doing anything, then first I'll give them the warning shot. Be like, hey, you hear voices or footsteps coming in your direction. You need to make sure something happens. So yeah, anytime that the players kind of grind to a halt in progress, that's when you start pushing the random encounters. Yeah, I mean, if it's anything to do with fights, my advice for fights taking too long is that you have a lot of options to make fights shorter. I talked about a little bit earlier, using that morale system that I do. It's like, okay, once an individual creature reaches 50% hit points, they start making morale checks, which is a charisma check basically, to say whether they're going to stay in this fight, because now it's getting serious and they might die. And that self-preservation is sort of like that flee or fight sort of switch flips, and they go from the fight side, and then they go, oh, nope, time to leave. And they leave the fight. And then so it's for each individual, and then each individual monster starts to make those same checks regardless of their hit points if less than 50% of their numbers remain. So if you get attacked by 7 goblins and 4 of those goblins die, the last 3 are like, we should probably get out of here. Does that take away their agency? No, they still have the... How they deal with a random encounter is the agency, right? They don't get to choose the obstacles, they get to choose how they deal with the obstacles, right? That's why we give them the warning shot first off, right? Be like, hey, this is me warning you as a DM. Like, I am what they call telegraphing you. I am telling you that monsters are coming this direction and you need to do something about it. Yeah, just the monsters. Sorry. Yeah, just the monsters. That's all we're talking about. Not the PCs. Yeah, just the monsters. The bits, the little plastic pieces we control. We're not messing with. They get to make all the choices they want, and they get to live with all the choices they make. Basically, we are assuming that we got to this hex, and there's going to be a point of interest here. Now, as far as we know, our nearest town is sort of over here, which means the frontier for it would be kind of these immediately adjacent squares, and everything outside of that is wilderness. So, in this circumstance, probably not going to be the wilds, right? Or it's not going to be anything but wilderness stuff that we're going to come across. Probably not going to be a fort or a village or a keep, some sort of castle, anything like that. Because as far as we know, this is deep into the wilderness. Right, there's not a lot of human activity going on here. But let's say that we rolled one, and because we rolled one in the wilderness, it's only that it has to be this 1d20 roll. So the first thing I want to do is I might want to decide the theme, if I want to. Sometimes I use this, sometimes I don't. Sometimes I kind of skip through it and just kind of choose one, so it's kind of up to you. But there is a framework here if you want to go full random and not really have to use your brain for this sort of stuff. You can rely on this system, or if you have an idea. What I usually say is that if you have an idea for something, there's no need for the random tables. You don't need to roll for something. If you have an idea, run with the idea. If that's going to be fun, if you think that's going to be fun for you and your players, just go with your gut. Like, just go with it. Don't worry about trying to back that up. If I'm like, oh, well, I was thinking about there's going to be gnolls in the dungeon, so I thought it would be kind of cool if maybe they came across an advanced sort of like scouting party or something like that. Well, we're in the wilderness. It's kind of unlikely that they're going to run across a ton of gnolls. So if I roll this, I'll probably get something else. We'll see what I'm going to get in just a second. But I might just opt and be like, no, I'm just going to use the gnolls because I want there to be gnolls. That's fine. You are fully empowered. In fact, you should lean into it. If you have an idea, follow the idea. Go with your gut. Right? Because the random tables will be here for all the times that you don't have any ideas. Any of the times that you're just like, yeah, you run across something. So we're in the wilds. So we roll a d6. I'm like, I have no idea what's sort of out here because they're just kind of doing their own thing. We don't really have a theme, kind of any sort of like motif kind of going on. All right, so I rolled a 5, which is, I don't think we need this anymore. I'm going to go ahead and drop that out. So something weird, and these it's basically 2 tables that you got to roll on. So that's again why I say, like, if you have an idea, just go with the idea, because it kind of drops an extra step in there that maybe you don't need. But you can see that these are basically set up, this Heartlands, Marches, and Wilds. In fact, I will just bold these real quick. There we go. So you're more likely to run across artificial things when you're in sort of the Heartlands. And then in the Marches, everything's equally weighted. You're just as likely to come across sort of humanoid-based stuff, as well as sort of natural beasties, as well as just weird extraplanar stuff. And weird is usually what I use for extraplanar. Like, this is some sort of outsider influence. But you see that natural things very rarely happen in the Heartlands, right? Humanoids and civilization just kind of push natural beasties away. We kill them and we clear the lands for ourselves, and we sort of push them out into the wilds, right? We push the wilds back. So you're most likely going to run across humanoid kind of centric stuff, but also there's plenty of weird extraplanar stuff. I mean, all we got to do is look at the very beginning of Baldur's Gate 3, right? The Nautiloid ship shows up in the middle of a city. Here you go. Right? Weird stuff happens. Portals exist, right? People can just jump planes, so it happens. You have all sorts of weird, especially humanoid creatures that can also pretend to be humanoids, right? Or shapeshifters, or have access to actual spells that they can disguise themselves. So it's very easy to kind of push them into Heartlands as well. But it's less likely that, hey, if you're, you know, in between like a few different towns and maybe a city, that you're going to run across a lot of sort of like natural monstrosities. Like we said, maybe not a ton of those Gnoll raiders, because Gnolls are technically monstrosities. But you're going to run across probably more, because again, artificial, less Gnoll raiders, but you might run across more bandits, right? More humanoid-esque bandits. So we're kind of leaning into the already existing, at least, again, this is all 5e based at this point, but you can very easily change out these categories for your preferred system if it has monster categorization to kind of align with these. And then in the wilds, you have basically the exact opposite. You're less likely to come across humanoid stuff, right? You're not going to run across a lot of, even something like, if we were to think about bandits as even something like Robin Hood. Like, Robin Hood is clearly in a civilized area, right? They are right next to Nottingham, right? And his own family estate, right? The Locksley estate. So they're very much in the Heartlands, right? They're not off in the wilds somewhere. But you get off in the wilds, right? Less likely you're going to run across humanoids. More likely you're going to run across natural beasts for the most part. And then weird is equally weighted wherever you are, because weird stuff just happens, right? Planar stuff just happens. So you're more likely to run across something, let's say celestials. Like, if you're in the wilds, you're more likely to run across a unicorn. Right, but if you're in, say, the Heartlands, you might run across more angels or other sort of angelic, sort of devas, angelic beings. If we want to go with the angel theme, celestial theme. And then the marches, you might have quaddles, who knows. Again, the celestial list is relatively short, so maybe it wasn't the best example. But yeah, so we're going to do the wilds. Let's roll our 1d6. Oh, we rolled 1d6 already. Remember the things you've already done. So a 5. So we know it's going to be something a bit weird. So just roll a d20 on the subtable. This table also used to originally included oozes, which is now only on the artificial side. But used to include oozes in both of these. But very quickly I realized that means there's a ton of ooze encounters, which feels very not right. Because I originally had them in both lists because D&D specifically has ecology that oozes come from 2 different sources. One of them is weird, like I just forgot it. I was going to say Magoobliet, but I'm pretty sure that's the goblin god. Right? Anyways, they talk about it being sort of like extraplanar divined. But there's also ecology that says oozes are just made by wizards. Like the way that owlbears are. So originally I had them in both categories because they come from both sources. But after a while I realized, oh, well, they should really only be on one because oozes are coming up too often. And so I moved them out of weird because weird is equally weighted across all of them. And I was like, alright, well, oozes can show up everywhere, but they're not... They felt too common, so I was like, well, I'll just put them in the artificial side. Because I feel like it makes more sense for them to show up in very sort of structures, dungeon-esque kind of places, and less sort of like just out and about in the wilds, like slimes in Dragon Quest, which always struck me personally. It's kind of weird that slimes are just a thing that just kind of roll around, because they don't seem particularly good at hunting in open ground. So I took them out of the weird category. Yes, the ooze fiend. That is what I'm thinking of. There is a demonic and a demon. Demon or devil, whichever. There is a fiend from which they respond to him. Yes, not a god. So we need to roll on this table. It's a d20. Let's find out what it is. 20. All right. Some sort of fiend. All right. So something fiendishly inspired. That's all we need. That's all the theme tells us. It doesn't tell us what the thing is. It just means that if I can find a way to relate it to it being fiendish, to kind of give it a little extra, little flavor, a little seasoning on top, that's what I'm going to look for. I'm not beholden to it, right? Anything that comes with the tables, you're never beholden to the tables. The tables serve you. You don't serve the tables as a DM, right? That's the common advice. It's like the tables are tools to help you. They're not a box to like box you in, man. Right? They're not not there to tell you what to do. You're there to use them, right? And if you end up not using it, or things that kind of don't make sense, you just drop things until they do make sense, or choose something else. So we're looking at something fiendish, and we need a d20 for our point of interest. What is the actual point of interest that they find? A 2? Okay. Well, I know what that is offhand, but just in case, for you that don't know, we're looking at a holding. So we didn't think, right again, we didn't think that we were in the Heartlands, but as it turns out, looks like maybe we're in a little bit of a little frontier castle situation, a little keep on the borderlands situation. And so then I'll just be over here, and I'll use this little shield icon. That's the stamp I always use for keeps. All right, and there's a little keep, and then usually there's like a little hamlet or something that sort of accompanies it. It doesn't have very many people in it because we're using a very small scale at this point. So it's probably got, you have a keep that's off by itself with maybe like 50. Yes, Jubilex. Yes, that is the demon's name. Thank you. That's who I was thinking of. I was like, I know Magubliet's not right. I know that's wrong. So yeah, so there is a keep with a setting here. We're like, oh, that's an interesting point of interest. Maybe we can talk to these people. If we're looking for an adventure location that's like maybe here-ish, we can talk to them. We can maybe try to stay the night there, especially if somebody try to use those 5e background features. Like if somebody has the noble feature where they can just get room and board from another noble, we could use that here. Otherwise, they might need to pay them or make a good impression, or maybe they need to entertain the noble by telling them stories of their adventure as the news of the world, right? Those sorts of things that people at this minor lord's keep might want to know about. We can tell them that, and now it becomes sort of its own. It has its own energy, right? Its own fuel to sort of roll out, and depending on how you feel about improvising as DM and how your players are, this can be the rest of the session, right? They might spend the rest of the session in this person's castle, being entertained by them, talking about them, getting a lay of the land, like they'll trying to get more information about these hexes that are around their keep, their lands, right? Try to find information about the adventure location, maybe see if they can get paid for some other adventures here, right? I talked about in that prep having some rumors or adventure seeds and having some like just basic, really simple 1-page or 5-room dungeons on hand that you can just kind of toss out for adventures. Be like, oh yeah, well, here's an adventure seed, and here would be the dungeon I would use, and here's where I would say that location is, and then go look for it, and then I can always just add a note down here and be like, hey, this is where dungeon, let's say, just because it's the one that I looked at last, old Richard's livery is. Hey, there is this very famous livery. This noble's like, I had a number of horses at being taken care of at Old Pritchard's Livery to the northeast. Unfortunately, Pritchard's Livery flooded a few weeks ago, I think, and in a flash flood, and all those horses died. I'm really upset about it, and they say that there's still money in there, but I haven't seen it yet. I'd like to get recouped for my horses, and obviously I will pay handsomely for that. And that can spawn off into its own adventure, and it's like, and I empower you as the Lord, that you get scavengers' rights, that you can take whatever you want from whatever you find in there. Something like that. Yeah, exactly, chat. Talking about using your PC's background choices when determining random encounter settings. Yeah. When you're talking about things like that, and you can do that for any of those things. So if you had somebody who, let's say, had animal handling in this situation, they might be more interested in something like that. They might want to talk to, like, I just know it because I have it on hand. I have the adventure literally right next to me because I was just looking at it. I know because I was just reading it. And so if you have a handful of these dungeons, it's very easy to kind of have a basic grasp about what they do until you run them. So the idea is keep those dungeons, those little adventures, very, very short, very easy to sort of hold in your head or to quickly flip through when you need adventure ideas on the fly. So I might flip through that and be like, okay, well, you know, there's some potentially something you can get that's worth animal handling wise that you might want out of there. You might be able to talk to old Pritchard because we know that Pritchard is in the nearby village, which this would probably be that village. Or it could be way over here, depending on how much time we want them. If it's over here, right, if we put it back the way they came, the likelihood that the PCs are going to backtrack to go talk to Pritchard is lessened. Let's say it that way. They're probably not going to backtrack, especially if they're looking for an adventure location up here. So we'll just drop Pritchard right here. He's living right now in here and working for the Lord themselves, right, to maybe pay off their debt. Something like that. So it's very easy to sort of drop those things in, and that can be its own sort of side adventure, especially if whatever this adventure location that we haven't materialized in this example doesn't have a very strict time frame. If it's like, no, you need to get it before because they have hostages and they're gonna kill them or sacrifice them or eat them or whatever your monsters are doing to the people. If they don't have that sort of time constraint, or like, oh, well, it's got to be, you've got to take care of this before they do their ritual under the full moon, or whatever the case is, whatever your timer is for the adventure, or maybe there isn't one. Maybe you're just, like we said, just kind of running around, letting them explore and decide what they want to, what trouble they want to get into on their own accord. Be like, hey, you know, there's an adventure location over here. You know, there's a dungeon that's supposed to have maybe one specific magic item or like one specific very expensive piece of loot in it or something that's kind of drawing them there. And they're like, okay, well, that's sort of an evergreen opportunity, right? There's always going to be that. So while we're here, why don't we just go check out Old Pritchard's Livery? We could do that little dungeon real quick. We can come back and do that. And as they go and talk to Pritchard, and they can learn about things like other rumors that go on with that adventure, with this adventure, include there are 2 missing youths, and it's supposed that there's a pond behind the livery. That's what flooded in the flash flood. So they're supposed to be on that fishing trip, and you can go see. That might be the rumor they pick up first. It doesn't matter, or that might give them an impetus to be like, hey, there are lost kids. That's a little bit more time sensitive than just delving in old dusty ruin. So maybe we'll go check on the kids, try to deal with that stuff first. Then we'll come back. Then we'll go back to sort of like the main adventure. So you can kind of throw those little side quests in there, however you want as you're doing this. Or if you want to cut because you prep this adventure location, I just don't give them adventure seeds. Be like, yeah, well, you know, everything's going all right. Don't really have a ton of big problems. But and that's when they'll be like, hey, but make sure on your return trip, why don't you come back and tell me about your adventures, and you know, maybe I'll have some work for you then. So that way you can drop an adventure seed later if you want to. And they know, like, once they go to the dungeon and do that, they can get back to a safe haven, basically, to rest. So yeah, there are 20 points of interest. We see the break right here for Marches and Wilds. where we roll. So everything above that is that D12 I talked about. So these primarily only happen in the Heartland's very developed, civilized areas. You're going to run across more settlements, more holdings, more religious sites, more travel havens, more crossings, more monster lairs, more meeting places, isolated homesteads, informative signage, omens of warnings, natural resources, and then number 12 is a fun one that I really like in this list, is construction. So you're going to run across a building site, basically, and then you roll a d10 and you take one of these. So I might roll a d10, let's say I roll a 5. So you come across basically a river that's got a little village in it, and they seem to be actively building a bridge over the river to kind of facilitate trade, to try to grow their town, that sort of thing. So the idea being that you kind of, as part of my own world, I want the world to feel like it's always moving forward in time. So I can add a piece of construction in there, and then I know if they ever come back to this construction, there's a chance that it's completed or has been abandoned, or maybe they have some sort of issue that the adventurers can deal with, right? Maybe they had to halt construction because they keep getting attacked by, I don't know, the bullywugs on the other side of the river. They kind of come out of the river and attack them every time they try to work on the foundations for the bridge. And so they're just kind of stuck in this area, and they're like, we need adventurers to kind of help, keep the bullywugs at bay, or like get them moved out of here so we can at least set the foundations for the bridge. And they're willing to pay for something like that. And we also have that same thing, so 13 is very similar, and you roll a ruins. So basically the same thing for construction, but we're seeing, instead of things moving forward in time, we're seeing them kind of decay over time. So I might roll for, let's say, that crossing. Now we can have that same bullywug situation, but it's actually the ruins of the bridge. Maybe they have half destroyed that bridge. It can deal with that instead. So same situation, but slightly different flavor, right? It's all about a lot of the context, right? You can do a lot of the same things, but by tweaking the context a little bit, it still continues to feel fresh again and again and again. And then things that sort of also happen there's a conflict area, which is basically two creatures and or factions or groups are in some sort of like armed conflict. Sometimes, and some of them, they might be hunting grounds. Like a recent example that I had was that I was working on, I ended up rolling elephants and drakes. And I was like, okay, well, this is a elephant herd like area, and drakes have nested and made it their hunting ground. So if you travel through this hex, there's a likelihood that you're going to see some sort of conflict happening between drakes and elephants, right? You guys are walking along, and then the ground starts rumbling, and then there's a herd of elephants like charging directly into view, charging at your group. What are you going to do? You're like, oh no, we're going to try to get out of the way. And you're just like, oh, as you're getting out of the way, you can see over all the dust they're kicking up, you can actually see the shadows of large winged forms chasing them. And then you see them maybe diverting and starting to come in your direction to check you out. And then, the players might be like, oh, we're going to fight this drake. But they might be like, I don't know if that's a drake, I don't know if that's a dragon, I don't know what that is, because I'm just seeing the dark underbelly of it. So I say we run away from it. And so maybe they're going to look for like a copse of trees or some sort of wooded area, some place where they can sort of like break line of sight and kind of hide from this drake. And so they might, you're right, that's a whole little side adventure you can have. It is kind of a random encounter, but it's also not a random encounter. It's just kind of what happens when you go through this hex. That there's a chance that, you're going to run across what you now know is sort of a drake's hunting ground. And so there's the likelihood that you're going to get spotted by drakes and attacked by drakes if you hang out here. But because there's elephants, you might want to hang out around here, because if you're playing that very, very heavy discovery heavy style of game where there's not really an overarching narrative that you're trying to do, or maybe you're sort of in a lull between adventures just trying to kind of give them a breather, you might be like, hey, well, you might have an enterprising player or PC that's motivated, especially by money, and be like, hey, so you said this is a drake hunting ground. And he said there's a herd of elephants that they seem to be sort of preying on. What if we spend a few days, like, searching the area trying to find ivory from hunted elephants, and collect that ivory from already dead elephants, and that we can sell for high value, right? That's a very luxury resource item. Okay, maybe that's going to be your game for the rest of the session. And they're like, all right, we're going to make camp in this copse of trees where we know the drakes can't get into and they won't see us. And then that's going to be our base camp. And for the next, maybe 2 or 3 days, we kind of search around the hex, trying to find as much ivory as we can. And I might give them a group perception check. And then for every day that they do it, the DC goes up and up and up, because it's less likely they're going to find stuff. And then eventually they're going to hit a point where they don't find anything, and they'll be like, all right. And you can decide how much time you want them to spend there, and maybe potentially like how much money you want them to have in game, right? And also remember that ivory tusks they're elephant tusks, so they're big, right? They're not small. So be like, all right, how are you guys gonna carry around all these tusks, right? How are you gonna do that? It's not really a manageable size. So if they don't have a bag of holding or something, they just kind of shove those in, and they don't have a cart with them or some sort of mule or something. It's like, how are you going to deal with these giant pieces of ivory that you're trying to transport? And that becomes its own sort of obstacle that they have to get over and sort of like figure out how they're going to do it. So yeah, I mean, that's kind of what I'm looking for out of the system. And I think that my system kind of does really well, is it kind of gives you these things to kind of jump into and be like, the story kind of just bakes itself, right? You just kind of set up situations and opportunities and kind of hand the toy to the players and be like, okay, play with the toy. What are you going to do? And so, yeah, that's dropping a point of interest in. And that's just a point of interest, right? That wasn't a random encounter. It wasn't some sort of dressing. That was just like, if you go on this hex, there's a likelihood this thing is going to happen. And enterprising adventurers can find their own adventure, right? If they're looking for adventure, they can find it. So, yeah, let's talk about camp. So, we travel. Let's say that we did our travel like we said we were going to do, and we've made it to our adventure location just for poops and giggles. Let's say it's here. So we decided to rest overnight and go to the adventure location in the morning, which there's no way that we're going to be exhausted by the time we get there. It is a 6 though, just because I use 2d6, so most likely you're going to run across the same biome again and again. Usually not this often, though. That has not been usually my experience, but it is more likely what's going to happen than not. Here, and we know that, let's say it's a dungeon. I do know that the dungeon's going to be here. Let's do this. I usually use this little dragon guy to note there's a dungeon there in a hex. And this is HexTML. If you haven't used it, it is hextml.playtest.net. And you can find it online. It's a free web app to make hex maps, and you can save them and load them and make notes and stuff. It's really useful. It does get pretty sluggish when you get big maps going, but for small maps, even maps of much larger than this, it runs very, very nicely and gives you a lot of tools to kind of very easily do the stuff. And it has more tools that even I don't use, that kind of use it for running the game. If you're running an online game, it kind of gives you options, views that you can share with players and things like that, which is very useful. Let's say we want to go here, and actually let's say that we opted not to go here and we just went straight there. Or let's say that we know it's in the next, I don't know why I'm doubting myself. We make it there, but it's at the end of a long day, right? We had our wizard really push themselves. Let's call back to that example from the beginning. Wizards really push themselves. They've got 2 levels of exhaustion, and we're like, all right, well, we're in the hex, right? We let the players choose their hex action. All right, well, they don't need to search the hex for the point of interest. In this case, we'll say that they stumbled upon the hex, the point of interest. They knew where it was. They kind of looked for it. They found it. Well, so we already know where it is. We're not going to travel to the new hex because we're at the location we're looking for. So we can either go into the dungeon or we can basically end the travel day and go to camp. Maybe things are really quiet. Normally I would penalize players if they're like, we're going to camp right outside the dungeon. Okay, well, the monsters don't stay in the dungeon. They walk in and out of the dungeon. They usually have monsters, sentries or guards or patrols or stuff outside of the dungeon because it's, well, D&D is a very conflict-heavy place. Any D&D setting is very conflict-heavy. And so, especially if you're living in a cave or something that doesn't have an actual door, you don't know when some rampaging troll is going to roll by. So it's nice to have patrols out, right? Some sort of guards. Something that keeps the adventurers out. So, again, like I wouldn't say usually, if they try to rest right outside the dungeon, then there's more likely it's almost guaranteed they're going to have some sort of encounter that's going to interrupt their rest. Just the natural people coming in and out of the dungeon, you know, who live there, because dungeons are homes for monsters. So we go down here, they're like, alright, we're going to end the travel day. So we're going to set camp. That's easy. There's no roll. It's just like, you know, you guys decide whether you're making a fire, you set up tents if you've got tents. If you don't have tents, you know, that's going to be an issue. Let's say if that's heavy raining or something, you're going to try to sleep under the stars while it's raining heavily. Or maybe you might give them some sort of wilderness check if they're trying to make some sort of survival shelter for themselves if they don't have tents. That sort of thing. And then the supply die. We're not going to get into the supply die. If you want me to cover that topic, just leave a comment down below and we'll talk about the supply die. It's my attempt, but many people use, even many published systems use supply dice as resource dice. It's a way to make resource management a little bit more interactive than ticking off boxes, right? Because that's sort of how D&D approaches it. It's either you either don't keep track of resources completely, which most people don't for like ammunition and food and encumbrance and things like that in modern games, in modern D&D, or you like tick off boxes and do math for encumbrance, and like those are kind of your primary options in a lot of, primarily D&D, but in other systems it's like you can either have the most granular bookkeeping aspect of it or do none of it, and there's not. The supply die is people's attempt to like kind of make a somewhat interesting middle ground. And so if you want more information about that, just drop a comment in and I'll take a look at it, and if there's enough people who want to know about it, then we'll use it. If you want to see it in action, again, go watch the solo RPG series I do. That's the way that I keep track of rations, we keep track of animal feed, we keep track of ammunition, we do all of that with supply dice, just to make it a little bit easier, and also kind of give that chance that, you know, there's a chance that you could just run out of things and not be prepared for it. Which adds a little danger for actual, like, overland travel and exploration and traversal. To be like, you could always just run out of food, and that's not a great place to be when you're out in the middle of nowhere. Like, if we look at our map, and, well, let's say we weren't there. Let's say we were, like, here. Be like, well, we're out of food. What are we gonna do? Like, some of our food we overate, some of it spoiled, some of it got into, like, maybe wild animals got into it while we were sleeping and tore through a lot of it. Maybe we got a bad batch of dry goods and it's absolutely full of weevils or all sorts of things, and so we can't eat it. So a lot of this is just bad and we can't eat it. It's sort of, the supply die kind of adds those elements into things rather than be like, oh, well, you got 10 days of rations, so you will always have those 10 days of rations and they will last forever. The supply die says, yeah, that's not really how that works. You think you have 10 days of supplies. You think. But supplies go bad, you lose them, they get wet, animals get into it, weevils, you eat too much, right? It's not like MRE style, right? You have basically a supply, whether maybe that might be flour or rice or something like that, and you make too much porridge, you make too much rice, right? You overserve yourself in the beginning of the adventure, and then you end up turning around and you don't have enough food. So the supply die kind of looks at things like that, and you're like, okay, well, now we're in the middle of the wilderness, what are we going to do? trying to add that sort of real element of sort of threat to just getting places. If you want that. If you don't want that, that's fine. If that's not the type of game you want to play, then just forget about that part. So the other thing that I like to do is have this sort of optional morale boosting actions. So this is basically camp actions. Everybody's in camp, and the group as a whole, and the easiest way to do this is just kind of vote if you want to. And just be like, do you guys want to try to do a morale boost? Yes, no, yes, yes. Okay, majority rules. Everybody has to participate. We're gonna try to. You guys are gonna try to do a morale boost. And basically, what you do is you look at your character sheet. You look at what the things you have, whether that's skills or toolkits or whatever, and come up with some way. In a lot of ways, it's just like, what is the best roll that you can make to try to boost everybody's morale? You're like, oh, well, I've got... And it's also a way to make use of those toolkits that often don't get used in D&D 5e. Well, I'm trained in a cobbler's kit. I will try to, take a look at everybody's boots and try to get them in good condition and make sure they're ready to travel, do any sort of repairs on them, those sorts of things. You're like, okay. And so you make a roll. If you succeed, then everybody's like, oh, well, thanks for taking care of my boots. Everything's great. They feel great. You really fixed... The toe was kind of coming apart. Thanks for, re-nailing that back down and treating the leather, and now everything's really comfortable. That sort of thing. And might be waterproofing it, right? Putting some waterproofing materials on the outside. Really trying to take care of that. Maybe you have cook's utensils, and you're like, I try to make the best meal that I can for my people, for my compatriots, for my group, and try to feed them. Maybe you have animal handling, and you're like, I'm gonna brush down all the horses and give them oats and some apples from our supply, and take care of them and make sure they're good. Deal with do some hoof care. Maybe I'm going to, if I have somebody else who maybe has some smithing experience, maybe they can jump in and be like, yeah, I'm gonna also help with that. I'm gonna do some light farrier work and try to reshod some of these horses real quick with some of the horseshoes we have on hand, that sort of thing. And maybe you're down to somebody like your bard who's like, well, I kind of want to lean into my character a little bit more, so I tell a great story, or I play music for the group around the campfire to just kind of boost everybody's morale, try to keep them in high spirits. Basically, that's what you're trying to do. You're trying to keep everybody in high spirits as you adventure. And the great thing about morale is that it's a group basically skill check. If more people succeed than fail, and then you get advantage or disadvantage on the next day's Constitution saving throw for the travel phase. So it's a good way, especially for low-level adventurers who might not have horses and pack animals and things like that, who aren't already getting advantage on those rolls, to try to get advantage on those rolls. But if you opt in, there's a chance that you could get disadvantage. And the idea being that you try to do these morale boosting activities and they don't work. Right? Let's just run back through it. You're like, oh, well, I try to take care of people's shoes, and people are like, oh, what? Now my shoe fits weird. What did you do with my shoe? Now it's all awkward, and now I'm not happy about it. Or like, hey, you didn't ask me about my shoes, or maybe I need my shoes, or you ran out of time and you didn't do my shoes, and now I'm upset about it. Maybe you burn the food. You just make a really crappy meal. Maybe you give somebody some light food poisoning or something like that, where you don't want it to be like mechanically food poisoning, but you're just like, yeah, this is not good. Like maybe some of the supplies were not fresh enough, and it's mildly upsetting, or like it's too spicy, or who knows what the case may be. That doesn't go over well. Or maybe people are just tired of having hardtack, right? They're just tired of having iron rations, and it didn't really matter whatever way you tried to dress it up with your chef's tools. Like, you just don't have the means to make a good meal. You guys screw up with the horses. Maybe the horses are irritable. You're not able to you actually end up injuring the horse, not in a mechanic way, but just like they're not happy. Maybe you get them sick with something you give them, or they're unsettled by something, or who knows, maybe one of the horses kicks you, not in a really hurts you kind of way, but in a way that, you know, it doesn't leave you in good spirits and kind of leaves you injured, right? There's ways to sort of fail that morale boost and be like, guys, I'm just frustrated, right? You have that bard who picks up their instrument around the campfire while everybody else is trying to work on stuff and starts singing, and you're like, look at this lazy piece. Like, we're here, like, trying to do work, and they're just sitting there playing their stupid lute. Like, hey, do you want to help? Like, we're trying to do stuff here. And also, like, do you know any other songs? You've played that same song, like, 5 times today. Like, can you choose anything else? Do anything else that's helpful for us right now. To kind of showcase that sort of, like, frustration while they travel. That they can sort of, like, people can start to, like, get on each other's nerves and kind of bicker a bit. So, and again, this is all, for me at least, the morale boosting action is completely optional. If you guys don't want to focus on that, if you have players that maybe don't do a lot of RP, you're like, alright, well, we're not going to do that. So, if you guys want advantage, buy horses. Save up your money and buy some horses and get them feed and tack and bridle and care for them and that sort of stuff. And you'll just get advantage. As long as you're going in a place that horses can go, right? So after that, if you do any of that, then you set watches, people who are going to take watches throughout the night, and you're going to attempt a long rest. So, just hop down to, well, we'll deal with camp days in a second, but let's just hop down to resting. So resting, basically I do 1 encounter roll per PC. Then we do that same D12 roll. If we roll a 1, there's some sort of wandering monster. If we roll a 12, there might be wilderness dressing. In a lot of cases, the wilderness dressing is not applicable, right? It's not going to be. It's not going to be something, at least on my charts, that makes sense, because most of it's like stuff you run across, and that are like static things. So it's not something that moves. By that I mean, like, if you want to come across, like, I think literally one of the entries is like, you just get a nice view. It's a nice view of the landscape. And you just kind of sit and catch your breath, and you're just like, it's very idyllic, right? Well, I mean, I maybe that's not a good example, because you might make that your campsite, right? You might be like, campsite, well, you just enjoy a nice, you're on watch, and you just find yourself kind of staring out at this nice, beautiful vista, and you're like, you know, maybe things aren't that bad. Or maybe you failed your morale boosting actions, you're like, hate this place, and the only thing that's like sort of keeping you sane right now is being like, well, at least the view's nice, I guess. But it might be a wandering monster that you come across, and again, usually I don't use, you can tell this is an old document because I updated that language. So I moved it from, I usually don't talk about it as wandering monsters anymore for random encounters. I talk about them as being creature encounters, because I feel like if I throw monsters on there, that language sort of guides me specifically into making things a combat. Where I'm like, no, this is just a creature encounter. You just encounter some sort of creature, right? It could be, you know, maybe there's a family of raccoons that's just sniffing out around your camp, maybe trying to get your food, and you have to deal with that because you're who's on watch, and that's a creature encounter, but it's not really combat. But it could also be like, it, you know, 2d6 goblins attack, and whoever's on watch maybe gets a heads up on them and is able to wake people up for that encounter, if not. So then if you complete your long rest, which you should, then you get all the benefits of a long rest, including, so in our example, we have that wizard. That wizard is going to lose 1 level of exhaustion. So they were exhaustion level 2, now they're down to level 1 before they go into the dungeon. Which is still not great, because if you're doing exploration in the dungeon, you're going to need some skill checks. And they still have disadvantage on skill checks. But this is one of those things where, if you get to the end of the day, and maybe you haven't had a bunch of combats or something like that, and that cleric still has some spells left over for the day, which is pretty common, they might be able to cast that. They might be able to cast a spell that takes away one of the levels of exhaustion, right? Lesser Restoration, something like that. That takes away one of those. But then, remember, they have to do that during the camp, so that's before they rest, before they get their spells back, right? So now they have to think about, okay, well, there's always a chance that we're going to have a fight overnight. Do I want to use one of my last few precious spell slots to heal a level of exhaustion on the wizard, or do I want to keep that just in case we actually get into a combat? Right, choice, player choice, right? That's what we're trying to do. Here's the situation. What do you want to do about it? Right, you don't really know what's happening, so you kind of have to use your best judgment. You could not have any creature encounters that turn into fights overnight. Might not have any creature encounters at all. That's likely. They're not going to have any at all. Maybe you have one. Maybe it's not a combat. Maybe you just run across some other travelers and you have a nice chat. Maybe they join your camp. If they maybe make some light insight checks. They seem pretty trustworthy. You wake up everybody else on the team to like sort of meet them and get their okay, and everybody beds down for the night, and that's the end of it. Maybe you get some information. Maybe you do some like trading, that sort of thing. Swap stories and things like that, or maybe that they give you some sort of adventure seed. It could be some sort of rumor or adventure seed. So, yeah, that's why I try not to use the language monster or in encounters anymore. Because I think that, and that's a me thing, you can use that or not. But I think using the word monster leads me towards combat. Especially when we're in the context of TTRPGs. Whereas like if I used language like creature instead, I'm more likely to look at it as this is an opportunity that could be a combat, or it could not, depending on how you approach it. And then, the 2d6 goblins that sneak up on your camp in the night are probably going to attack, but might not necessarily. I might give them some sort of roll. I might be like, well, I think there's an 80% chance that they'll attack, right? I think that's most likely they're going to attack. Alright, well, I'm going to roll a d10. If I roll a 9 or a 10, then they're not going to attack. Oh, nope, I rolled a 1. They're absolutely attacking with incredible ferocity. Right? And that's maybe how I interpret that roll. Like, these are weird, and you can even like lean into it and be like, these are weirdly bloodthirsty goblins. And maybe you can even be like, there might be something wrong with them. If a player latches onto that and they're like, I'm gonna check them out. I mean, they seem like, we've dealt with goblins before, but these ones seem really aggressive. And I might have given them like advantage on their morale checks to like stay in the fight, even when it was clear they were gonna lose, but they were just so ferocious. Be like, do these maybe they have rabies, right? That could be a very fun thing, or have some other sort of curse or compulsion on them. They're sick, or right, lean into it and be like, we can spin this out, and it could be its own sort of adventure that they sort of chase down. Maybe they kind of follow their tracks, try to find out if there's more of these crazed goblins out there, maybe find out what's wrong with them. Depending on your players, maybe they want to help, maybe they just decide to kill them all and take their stuff. Your players are going to do whatever your players are going to do. But if they latch onto that, and especially if you're running a very discovery-heavy game where you don't have sort of an overarching plot that they're trying to take care of at the moment, I don't see any reason not to sort of lean into that if they show interest in it. If that's the random thing they decide to pick up on, sure, there's probably something wrong with the goblins now. Just like, I'm going to feed you. If you show me this is what you're interested in, I'm going to feed you some more of that. That's just what I'm going to try to do. And after they complete that rest, you do the morning travel prep. So we just zip all the way back up to the top. To here. And we do the whole thing over again. And we do that for each day. So that probably sounds like a lot as I'm explaining it. But it's actually pretty simple. Like, if you see the solo RPG series, like, it doesn't really take a lot of load for me, right? There's not a lot of things that we really have to figure out. The things most of the time we got to figure out is that if we run into some sort of random encounter, I have to build a random encounter on the fly if I don't want to use one of my existing charts. So Yeah, I mean, we could do that. I can show just an example really quick. Let's go to a couple Fight Club. Let's say these are, you know, I just played in 4th level games, so let's say they're 4 level 4 PCs. Right, we said that we were going to have our, it was a fiendish encounter, correct? I believe. I mean, we could do native environment, but usually these are very hit and miss if you use these. Yeah. So I said probably not gnolls. There's the gnolls right there. There's one of them. I mean, because technically this gnoll's a fiend. But I might be like, oh, you know, maybe this is a cool, like, Barghest encounter. Like, okay, well, 2 takes me to deadly. And I'll be like, alright, well, it's either 1 or 2. If I roll high, it's 2. Okay, 1. This random encounter's 1 Tanaruk. I just deal with it that way. Boom. Right, so pretty easy if you have a digital tool like this or you have a pre-made random encounter table. I feel like if you're going to make pre-made random encounter tables, and I do have those, I do those specifically. I'm making individual encounters basically for the native environments. So I'm like, okay, if we're, you know, look at the plane. We're in the plains, so I'll roll on the plains table for that type. So it's very simple. You do that and be like, all right, we're starting off the day. What's everybody's rolls? Okay, you rolled a 17, you rolled a 13, you rolled a 15, and you also rolled a 15. So 13, 15, 15, 17. All right, that's really good rolls, guys. That probably gave you advantage. That's why they're so high. So you guys are going to get a lot done today, probably. Then we can just look at how long it's going to take them to get to that 13. As they're just moving around doing stuff. Right, so they could get up to 6 hexes away, which is pretty good. And they can continue to push themselves, right? They want to push themselves to the next one. All that means is that that character that has a 13 has to make an active save now. They probably passed if they rolled a 15 on the die. So they're good. And now, I think one person's at 17, right? So now everybody except one PC would now need to start making active checks if they move any further. So at that point, they'll probably be like, we should probably camp. Right? We can push ourselves, but then like most of the party's going to have a level of exhaustion, and it's not great. We really kind of want to avoid that if possible. But you could be in a situation like we had. So if we jump back here, and if we step back in our alternate universe and we decide that we want to take the wizard here instead, right? And we're like, okay, we have our wizard has 2 levels of exhaustion. They are going to recoup one of those from their long rest. The other way to recoup that is basically to get an extra level is by spending a camp day. So camp day is sort of this last little bit down here at the bottom. So when you take a camp day, you're like, okay, and if you're pushing yourself because you're trying to get someplace fast, you might overexert yourself and get to a point where you gotta rest. And so you do what's called a camp day. And this basically gives you an easy way without a lesser restoration spell or something else to get extra exhaustion levels off of you. So you have to stay in some sort of a relatively safe place for a full day of rest and removes an extra level of exhaustion. Resting creatures cannot engage in downtime activities or any sort of strenuous activity. They basically can't be productive in really any way, shape, or form. And right, any of the party members or creatures in the party can do this by staying in a safe haven, staying in camp, or resting while traveling in a vehicle, like if you let them lay down in the back of the wagon, or you make a litter and drag them on sort of a litter for the full day, then they get that extra level of exhaustion. But if they get up and they get involved in a fight, if they really take an active role in any sort of like just RP scene, like dialogue heavy negotiation or anything like that, they're not going to get it. So they can't fight, they can't do that. They can't work on any downtime activities. If you have that wizard character and they're like, oh, we have this magic item puzzle box that I've been trying to uncover. Well, I got 8 hours to burn, so I'm going to work on the puzzle box. It's like, okay, you can't, but I'm letting you know, if you spend the time, if you're going to spend all day working on this, then you're not going to get the benefits of the litter. Right, because you're actively engaging in something. This basically, the camp day is basically like, you're just going to sleep, or basically enjoy yourself in a time that's not in any way sort of strenuous to you physically or mentally, right? Trying to solve a puzzle box, trying to like decode things like that, doing translations, working on downtime projects, things like that. Those aren't going to be things you're going to be able to do because they take too much focus, physical and mental focus, to do those things. You need to basically be relaxing, sleeping, reading a book, something like that. Maybe you can, if you have another member with you, maybe as you're traveling, your wizard has a deck of cards, and you play cards with like one of the other adventure members who's not pulling the litter, just to sort of pass the time. You guys, as they're walking, just sort of like picking cards and playing that way, just to sort of pass the time. You can do that sort of stuff, and sort of like character building RP kind of stuff, but you can't do anything adventure-y productive in a mechanical kind of sense. So let's say, right, we had our character who's got it there. Let's say that they're gonna rest there, and then they're gonna spend the camp day there. So they're basically gonna spend about 24 hours at this keep, and they're actually gonna set off. Based off of that, they're actually gonna set off probably later in the day, towards the evening, which is fine because they don't have very far to go to get to the adventure location. And at this point, if they're moving at least one hex, there's no way that they're going to fatigue themselves at all. You just can't. Right? Because you're going to meet or beat whatever. Even if you roll a 1, you're going to meet or beat your DC in that one move. So you're not going to get any levels of exhaustion. So you rest, and you kind of get this first one kind of for free. This first hex for free as you're moving. So you step over there. Boom, you're at the adventure location. You don't need to worry about that anymore. And your wizards are already back up. They're good to go. And you guys can go straight into the dungeon. It does mean that you play maybe a little loose and fast with technically needing 8 hours of rest in a 24-hour period. But the nice thing about sort of setting up how I do the hex crawling is that none of it's tied specifically to time. So that's sort of the fluctuation. Like, it might seem like a full day of adventuring to get there, but it might have only taken you maybe a few hours to get from here to here if you had a good pace to get there in one day. It just means that it took so much effort out of you that you feel very tired by the time you get there. Maybe they were, busting their humps and they were basically double timing it in their ways to get here. And the wizard's like, I'm exhausted. It's noon, but I've been basically running all morning. I gotta lay down. I gotta lie down and have a little nap or something, because I'm beat. I am not used to this sort of forced march, strenuous activity. I'm gonna curl up with a good book and do that. And so yeah, you just kind of do that day in, day out. And if you have an adventure location, it's a good way to sort of like fill in that travel as you're getting to an established adventure location. Maybe you have maybe not a one-page dungeon. Maybe you have maybe you want to do one of the published dungeons. You want to do something like something that comes out in one of the compilations, whether that's Salt Marsh or Candlekeep Mysteries or Yawning Portal. If you want to do a published module that kind of comes out, something that's not sort of a one-page dungeon, but something that's maybe going to take you somewhere between like 2 to 7 sessions, like a larger kind of dungeon that you kind of want to jump into, that you're interested in running for the group, you can do that. And then this sort of overland travel just provides a nice little bonus of like, hey, there's some fun stuff for you guys to do, right? You can come up here and be like, oh, we learned about that livery. You can go check out the livery and do that little thing. Maybe get a magic item out there. I'm pretty sure there's a magic item in there. There's quite a bit of money. I think there's a magic item in that adventure. And come back, and then maybe you spend it. You can do a little bit of limited trade, do some resupply here, and then hit the major dungeon for a few sessions, come back, take another rest, head on back to town, figure out a different location, keep moving on, or do something with the character backstory if you want to, do a little personal adventure for one of them. Give it that nice little zest, that nice little like diversity of gameplay. It's really fun. But I mean, that's basically the system. I mean, it took me a little bit to explain it, but in play, I mean, like I said, if you want to see it in play, just go check out the solo RPG series. There's an entire playlist you can see. You can watch this in action. The nice thing is that one thing that you'll see me do in the solo play with Leah is that there's actually multiple little hex crawl sandboxes. So we'll have the Split Valley Oasis one. That's the one where we start. And then you'll see us do an overland travel section, which is different from this hex crawl exploration. It's overland travel. We talked about the distinction. There's a distinction, and move to the Carjuntan one, and then there's an entirely different little hex crawl area for them to sort of discover and learn more things and figure out. But then later on, they travel back to Split Valley Oasis, and we don't do the hex crawl, right? We do overland travel back into the little hex crawl. So instead of feeling like you have to set up a gigantic world and you have to hex crawl through the entire world, you can just be like, we're just gonna have a world with a bunch of little sandboxes, and we can just kind of hop between them and use the overland travel rules. We can jump into the city, we can run an urban adventure in the city for a little bit, we can hop back out, we can jump to a different adventure location. If we need to go talk to the high priests at the temple that's 2 weeks away. Okay, we do an overland travel. Now we're there. We might not do a hex map if we're only there to talk to them about something, right? I don't need to do that, but maybe that'll have its own little adventure thing kind of going on. Maybe I want to spin it out, do a little social thing. Maybe it's a very diplomacy sort of intrigue heavy one where they have to convince a lot of people to sort of give them aid, and so they kind of have to go and persuade a number of different sort of people within the hierarchy of that sort of very important grand temple to sort of aid them in whatever they're trying to do. And then they jump back to the city, they finish up what they were doing in the city, and they jump back into the hex crawl mode and be like, hey, we want to kind of check out, we've heard some rumors about stuff kind of going on to the east, so we're going to head off, we're going to resupply everything up, we're going to saddle up our horses, we're going to head out east and see if we can find that sort of tomb or orchid raids or whatever the adventure seed is. We're going to try to go find that location out to the east and see if we can make some money off of that, or maybe we get an adventure from the city, right? We have our setup, we know what our goal is, we have our payment, we have a patron, they tell us what we need to do, and we just need to travel to that location. And if it's a close location, we could do the hex crawl. If it's a far off location, we could do overland travel to that location, or we could do overland travel to a new hex crawl sandbox that has that location in it somewhere. That's right, so it's kind of modular. You can kind of use it however you want, right? You can make it, there could be a lot of emphasis on it, there could be very little emphasis on it, and you don't have to do this idea that you have to do a bunch of prep beforehand where you have to build out this entire world and know everything that's in the world and be prepared for anything the characters do, anything that the players decide to do, anything they do, right? You have to be this sort of gigantic supercomputer within your brain, DM style. You just kind of fly, improvise, and the way that I like to think about improvisation is that if you don't need to improvise, if you kind of reframe how you think about improvisation as DM, if players get way off track, you planned for A and they decided they took a hard left and we're doing Y now, and you're like, I barely have anything, but we talked about like having some like little one-page dungeons or something like that prepped. You can just kind of throw something out there because you really only need to improvise until the end of the session. Wherever you are in the session right now, when things get way off the tracks, like outside of whatever you prepped for, you only need to get to the end of the session. So you might bog them down in town a little bit. Maybe they need to ask some more clarification, get some rumors. They need to get some more information about whatever the adventure thing is that they're off the rails on and got interested in. Maybe they're, like we said, maybe they're chasing down those feral goblins, and so they find a nearby village, or maybe they spend a bunch of time like looking for tracks in the wilderness and following them, and you're like, I have no idea where this is going. I don't have sort of a goblin layer prepared. We can just kind of throw some roadblock encounters, some obstacles in their path. Be like, oh well, it looks like it rained. Their tracks got a little muddy and washed out, so you're gonna have some difficulty there. Here's a random encounter, which may or may not be more feral goblins. Maybe they try to capture one and talk to one. You're like, all right, well now you get to have this fun sort of RP scene where they talk to a goblin that's clearly not in the right state of mind, and that can be really humorous, or it can be really kind of existential scary, right? If this is like, this goblin's clearly not in control or is being controlled by some other entity, and they try to figure out these little clues, and all that's leading up to, you're just like basically watching the clock. You're like, all right, I'm just trying to get to the end of the session, because once I get to the end of the session, I get to prep again. They have full intent. I know where they're going now. Now I just need to prep this thing about the goblins. That's super easy to do, right? I have a very pointed prep. Right, okay, well, they're probably gonna, maybe I go grab the old Cragmaw hideout, if they haven't played it. If they have played it, I mean, you could still probably run it again, and just swap a few things up, and they probably won't notice. Like, if you just seal up the entrance and put the entrance somewhere else, like, just like, take the map and scribble it out and then add an entrance somewhere else, then you can probably get away with it, for the most part, and do something like that, or grab a different goblin, or make one goblin dungeon, or make one by hand if you want to, whatever your prep process. But you only need to improvise long enough to get to the end of the session. That's it. So instead of thinking about, when we think about improvisation, GMs, sometimes we're thinking about just coming with everything off the top of your dome. It's like, no, it's just you prep things, and then when things get outside the prep, you only need to improvise and like stretch out things long enough to get to the end of the session. You do that, you get to prep again, and you know which direction they're going in, right? It's very, at least for me, reframing it in that way was really, really helpful. It really gave me an idea. It's like, okay, now I better understand what I'm doing as a DM. I better understand what I'm trying to do as a prep, in my prep sessions, and I understand what I'm trying to do when I need to improvise in a session. When I'm like, oh, I just need to keep them on the hook long enough until I get to the end of the session. And remember, I'm the DM, and you're the DM, presumably. We're in charge of the session length. We can just cut a session early. I mean, probably don't cut it if it's normally a 4-hour session. Maybe don't cut it an hour and a half in, right? But maybe like if you get to 3 hours, you can be like, ooh, maybe by hour one they're off the rails, and you're like, if I can just get 2 more hours of kind of stretching content out, and maybe throwing some random things at them, maybe giving them a little like one-shot dungeon to kind of jump into and deal with. I can play for time to at least hour 3, and once I hit sort of hour 3, between hour 3 and 4, I can kind of call it whenever I feel like there's a good stopping point, and then go jump back into the prep in between sessions, and then do the prep. Now that I know where they're going, and I know some basics about this situation. Okay, I know there's feral goblins. Maybe I know. I just take whatever I improvised, and that's why you take notes. Look at your notes and be like, okay, so I know there's a bunch of wild goblins that are out of control. I'm going to take their goblin stat blocks, the normal goblin stat blocks, and maybe give them some sort of, maybe I'll give them all, like, I don't know, barbarian rage or something like that. The idea that, like, they're an uncontrollable rage, maybe they're being led by some sort of demonic entity or something like that, and that's sort of some manifestation of rage. Maybe they made their home in some old tomb that's got this sort of rage fiendish shrine in it, or something that's sort of imbuing them with just this unquenchable rage and ferocity. You can do that, right? There's an idea for that right there, and I know that in the prep, and then I can just toss that in there, and now it's a cool adventure for them that spawned out of nothing. A random camp encounter, right? All that would spawn literally from me rolling to see, okay, goblins are sneaking up on the camp in the middle of the night. Are they going to be friendly? I rolled a 1. That's the exact opposite of friendly, and it's like, oh, well, they're extra ferocious. And they take that bait for whatever reason, and then we spin that out into its own adventure about this Archon of Rage shrine that's been uncovered by the goblins, imbuing them with this ferocity, and then I'm actually changing the goblin stat blocks to basically all give them permanent barbarian rage, so they can barely speak, maybe. Right? I mean, they can barely speak common anyways in a lot of interpretations. So, but maybe they just like they can barely get words out, like they froth at the mouth and stuff. They have this glazed over, wild-eyed look, like they don't ever sort of focus on people's eyes when they're talking to them, right? They don't like see you as another sort of like sentient entity because they're kind of losing their own sentience. So that could be a really interesting adventure, and that kind of spawns out from nothing, right? Having to improvise off of something that your players decided to grab onto. But that's why we only play for time, right? I'm only trying to improvise to get to the end of the session, and then I get to reprep. So yeah, that's basically the hex crawling. So I have the 2d6 biome variation. We didn't really talk about it too much. And this is the same one I used for the hex mapping one. So if you've watched any of those videos, then you're going to be very familiar with that 2d6 table. Very simple. I screwed this up. That would have actually changed things. This is how old it is. It's actually wrong. I don't know why it's wrong though. So it should just be +1 dryer. Basically, we just have a very simple scale from water all the way to desert as to basically how much precipitation the area gets. And then that changes latitude wise, whether you move from tropics to temperate to sort of Arctic areas. That'll change the type of forest, but the rest of this will stay pretty similar for the most part. Very, very simple. It's 2d6. Either it's the exact as the previous hex that you're coming from, it's a little bit drier, it's a little bit more verdant, it's got a little bit more greenery, it's waterlogged and it's become a wetland, or it's just water, or it becomes, drier, or it becomes a hill. Right? It's a hilly area, or if it's already hills, it's going to be a dale. So a lowland area in between hills. And then if it's a mountain, there's a 10% chance it's a volcano, and if we roll a mountain on a mountain, that means it's an extra tall mountain, and so it's a snowy peak. It's very simple. And then depending on where we end up, verdant-wise, we could see a mountain turn into sort of a heavy forest glen, right? Dale or glen. Yeah, so it's very simple. This is all written down in more detail than I would probably ever need to actually look at it. For me, most of this is memorized already, except for basically these tables. These tables I don't have down by memorization, but I can roll the 1d20 and figure it out very quickly without having to look it up, because it's either by 5s or by 4. And then you just have the POI, points of interest table, going through that. And then the camps, renew those things. But yeah, it's very, very, very simple once you get into it. I like it because it adds a lot of question marks for a lot of things, and it gives the players a chance to roll a lot of things. It gives those characters that put points into things like Constitution, which often kind of get overlooked except for hit points, and poison saving throws. Don't come up a whole lot. To be like, oh, but they're in really good physical condition, so they can obviously walk much further than the rest of the party can. They're clearly in better condition. so they don't need to rest as often. So they're much better at sort of that aspect of exploration, which is really fun. Makes them feel like, you know, it's nice to be able to give each sort of player's character an ability to sort of like highlight things that they're good at, and also that, especially in areas that they're much better than their peers in. Something like having that fighter or barbarian that's got a high constitution be like, they almost are never the ones that need to call for a rest. They're always the ones to be like, come on, we can just push like one more hex. You got it in you. We can do this. Come on. And the wizard's like, I've got 2 levels of exhaustion. If I go anymore, I'm gonna die, I think. No, you're fine. Come on, get in there. We got this. Look, how about I just carry you? I'm gonna just throw you in the litter and I'm just gonna carry you. And I could do that. I mean, that's really not something the system handles. We'd be like, if you're gonna spend the time to make a litter, I'll probably make you roll a travel pace for that. But once you do that, you could toss the wizard in the litter and just be like, we're just gonna drag him, and then the wizard doesn't need to make any more saves for the travel pace for the rest of the day. So you don't need to worry about the wizard's exhaustion levels. You just need to worry about the other people's. And then I'd probably give them the fighter, if there's the person pulling the litter, might give them disadvantage on it. Maybe not. I don't know. It'd have to be how I feel about it and maybe what the terrain's like. But very, very simple. And then the camp base help us take care of those extra exhaustion levels when we have them. So I just kind of want to end this with some additional topics that we kind of touched on, but maybe didn't go into a whole bunch. One of those is the supply die. We just talked about that earlier. When we're setting camp, we roll the supply dice. It's a way to sort of find a middle ground in resource management between just ticking off boxes of resources and not tracking them at all, but by making things sort of like ammunition, rations of water, magical components, things like that, kind of a little bit more gamey, a little bit more interactive, and kind of add a little question mark to some of those things. Be like, you think you have this much supplies, but none of this is really an exact science when you're doing it out in the field. Just kind of dealing with that. So if you want if you want to know about more about these topics, just leave a comment in there, and we'll kind of see what's popular, what people kind of want more explanation on, or kind of want my take on some of those things. I'll make new videos about that sort of stuff. Let's talk about search areas or hitting the box. If you've watched the solo RPG series, you've seen us do that, where we get a rumor about where something's supposed to be, and based off of the strength of the information that we get from maybe an NPC or a treasure map or whatever it is, we have a general search area in which we kind of do our little discovery exploration, and we keep searching that area until we hit it. As we're looking for something very specific in an area. So if you want to know more about sort of hitting the box and how to do that sort of things, and how to add that in, I can cover that as well. We talked a little bit about overland travel and it being different than hex crawling, like that sort of local exploration. So if you're interested in seeing how that plays together, like I talked about, like if you want to go from the city to an adventure location, and maybe you do an overland travel to that location if you know where it is, or maybe you do an overland travel and then you do the hitting the box search area for the local area, and then you find the actual adventure location. So then we're kind of melding those different forms of the game together to kind of create this more like comprehensive adventure loadout, which can be really fun. Kind of give them this idea. And also being the idea that, like, once you finish the dungeon, the adventure is not over. You still have to get back to where you came from. So you still got to deal with supplies. You might run into random encounters. You might have, depending on what happened in the dungeon, you might have bad guys that are still after you if you, like, were retrieving an artifact or something like that. Let's say that. You retrieved an artifact from a dungeon, you're trying to get it back to the patron that hired you to retrieve it, and now you have the remnants of the dungeon who are like actively tracking you and trying to hunt you down to try to get it back. And remember that their goal is not to kill the adventurers, not to kill the PCs, it's to get the artifact back. So they're more likely to try to like sneak into camp while the party's asleep and just try to steal it, try to find it. Maybe they try to attack them, maybe they chase them down in towns, they come after them in all sorts of weird asymmetrical ways. and maybe not just standard toe-to-toe fights where they try to steal stuff or poison them or do all sorts of weird things just to try to, because they're just trying to get the artifact back. And so you can have stuff like that, which is really fun. And so it kind of just adds a little bit more meat to the bones of any sort of adventure if you want to add those extra stuff in. Now, that being said, you probably don't want to do that for every adventure. That can be a little tiring. Sometimes it's just, you go to a place and you do the dungeon and you come back and that's fine. And then sometimes you want to add in the overland travel and that's cool. And then sometimes you don't. And sometimes you want to do the local exploration hex crawl aspect and sometimes you don't. Right? It's very versatile. Right? You're the DM, so you're the one that gets to be the driver's seat for what parts of the game you want to focus on. So if you don't want to focus on that stuff, don't have it in. Either entirely or in very specific circumstances. You can pick and choose however you want to sort of take it on. So talk about the node-based overland travel if you guys want more info on that and how that works. So things that happen while you're traveling but aren't hex crawling. So things that still happen on a travel journey. And those are both good and bad things that can happen on overland travel without having to do the very sort of fiddly, like we're doing here with the hex crawl, where like, okay, well, you're moving this far in a day and you're doing the camp days and you're looking for locations, and the overland travel is about you're trying to get to a destination, and there are some things that happen along the way. Like in any road trip, there's something that happens usually. And then the last thing that sort of we kind of touched on just barely was urban crawl. So basically taking a very similar structure to this and then applying it to moving it around the city. So in the solo RPG, we do that with Carjunton a little bit. And it's very, very similar here. And using this framework to basically allow, which kind of helps to kind of really pressure on that, especially if we want to really tune in the pressure on something like, maybe it's a murder mystery or something, some sort of like event, what they call event-based adventures in 5e. And this idea that it's some sort of crime spree, or you're trying to do something, a heist or something like that, and you have a limited window of time, and now you have a way to be like, here are the things you can try to do each day to try to set up and get ready for this thing, or to try to track down the murderer before they strike again, or something like that. You do the serial murders, and we talk about urban crawls and doing things like that. So if you're interested in any of those, make sure you leave a comment down, and I'll take a look at those, and we'll try to figure out which one of those are popular, which ones people want to focus on. Of course, next week we will be doing the solo RPG stream. Obviously, if you want to see a bunch of this hex crawling, specifically how it works, make sure you tune in. Our last session went through quite a bit of this. We're still in the middle of this. We're doing hex crawling the next time because we're looking for a specific location. So you're going to see that in action. So make sure to tune back in next week about this time, and I'll be taking a stab at that. Of course, afterwards, videos will be up on these videos will be up. So if you don't catch it live, don't worry. There'll be an opportunity for you to check it out later. The easiest way, of course, to do that, to make sure that you get notified of those videos, is to subscribe. So do that. Likes are always nice, comments are always nice, but more importantly, if you really want to help the channel out, you can always share these videos. It's really helpful. You can share it on social media, Reddit, Ian World, or your preferred RPG forum online. Other ways you can support: check out our coffee, ko-fi.com/redragonfiend. You can check out the blog, redragonfiend.com, for more noodly bits like this. If you're looking for more of this, we have an entire world building process series where we're starting from an absolutely blank page, building out an entire top-down world map, building out an entire top-down world campaign setting. It's a labor of love. It's not something you do for a campaign you're trying to start tomorrow. This is for setting up something where you're trying to build a world that you want to run a bunch of campaigns in. It's sort of a pet project that a lot of DMs go through. So if you're interested in that, check that out. Other things we do, I mean, that's most of the stuff. So check out the YouTube, check out the blog, check out the coffee. We also have some pay what you want downloads on DriveThruRPG.com. So same thing. Check us out over there, Red Dragon Fiend, for the publisher, and you can support us monetarily there, or just share stuff and let me know what you liked, what you didn't like, what you want to see more of, more importantly. And that's going to be it for me. Thanks for hanging out with me, guys. I hope And of course, tell me how this works for you. If you use this whole system, if you want to drop in and use the system, let me know how it works for you. Or if you make some tweaks or make some changes, let me know what those changes are. I'm always interested to hear that sort of feedback and see if it's something that I want for my specific game or not. Everything's up for... It's your game, you get to run it however you want. So make adjustments as you need. You might have a completely different point of interest table, right? This is my point of interest table, but you can substitute any point of interest table you want in here. So if you have a different point of interest table, let me know about it. That's it. I'll see you guys next time. Been fun. Bye. Bye-bye.